Most Christians believe that the Didache, an ancient Christian document, means Sunday when it says the Lord's Day. But careful scriptural and historical analysis reveals a startling fact that the writers of this document actually meant the Sabbath. And if that's true, what does it mean for our understanding of early church history?
If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shalt honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord. And I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father. For the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it.
Welcome to the show, everybody. Welcome to the Dance of Life podcast. My name is Tudor Alexander, and I'm your host, as always. Welcome to this very interesting, hopefully edifying, and important episode on something very, very nuanced that probably not too many people are aware of. It's going to be a continuation of some of the points that I discussed in another video in my response to Joe Heschmeyer's short. He's a Catholic apologist. He had a short debating with an Adventist about the Didache, the Sabbath, the early church history, and so on and so forth. So that's a pretty robust video. It's about 3 hours, I believe. So make sure you go and check that out. It's a very robust response. This is going to be a continuation of that and kind of a reiteration from different perspectives, presenting some new information on top of that. So if you're not familiar, then go check that other discussion out as well. Today is going to be comprehensive. So either way, you're going to get something good out of it, hopefully. We're going to be talking about these points about early church history, the Didache. If you don't know what that is, it's an ancient Christian document from around 100 AD that was written by Christians, obviously, and it's not obviously inspired, but it is a very important historical document because it timestamps the progression of Christianity. It's a very early document, so we can understand what the Christians of that time believed. So today we're going to be talking about the Didache. We're going to be talking about early church history. And of course, all of that is grounded in the discussion around the Sabbath. The Sabbath is the central issue of today and going forward with all the things that are about to happen in our timeline. But hopefully today is going to be very edifying for you, especially if you have an open mind. If these topics are new to you, then I hope that this video opens up some things for you and invites you lovingly and encouragingly, but putting some fire under your butt to learn some important truths. So please understand that the topics discussed here are defended ad nauseum in my Sabbath series, in my Lord's Day series, which I'm going to put this video as kind of a bonus piece there at the end of that series. I'm going to add it to the end of the series because it complements the research that I did in that series. And when I was initially doing the research, I didn't come across this particular information that I'm going to be presenting to you today. Nevertheless, I'm going to be adding it to that. So If you've seen those series before, this will be a great compliment. If you haven't, then please watch the rest of the series. The Truth About the Lord's Day. It's a very important series. The Sabbath series, together that's probably over 40 hours of content, and very, very important information because the Sabbath will be the topic of our generation. Again, if that's news to you, then watch the series and learn why, so you can understand. If these topics are not new to you and you've visited these things before, you've watched my videos, then hopefully today is going to be another powerful weapon that you can leverage with lots of ammunition in your discussions with various groups, because this is a very important topic. And this particular topic today, the Didache and the early church history surrounding the change from the Sabbath being on the seventh day to the first day eventually, after Constantine, is a very important discussion. It's a very nuanced discussion because Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and even harlot Protestantism will all manipulate church history and twist scripture and basically present a narrative that Sunday keeping and Sunday Sabbath goes all the way back to the apostles and Jesus, which of course is absolutely not true. And today you will learn that again. If you've learned it already, you're going to learn it again. If you haven't learned it, then hopefully you will learn it today. So today we will give you lots of information and ammunition on this topic. And with that, make sure you subscribe, like, leave a comment for the algorithm here and there. Hopefully something positive that other people can be edified by as well. Also, if you want to support me, you can go to the website. You can be a free member there. Just stay in touch. Just join the email list. That's the safest bet, because then I'm always going to be in touch with you. You can donate if you feel so called. You can check out some merch, some important products there that can help your edification journey. You can also buy a USB. And in fact, as of the time of this video now, we have the upgraded AI USBs have their own little sticker on it, if I can get it right. See, it's got that little matrix. It's really cool, actually. It's got like a matrixy kind of background. This is the AI upgraded USB. And that is, it's the same USB, except it's got like hundreds and hundreds of JSON files that you can train. If you do AI training, or if it's something that's interested to you, you can train and have my data for training if you want it. So that's available to you. Obviously, it's going to cost a little more than the normal USB, but that USB is available. 900 plus hours of my content. This particular video is not going to be on that original USB. I do plan on releasing an add-on USB with the Bible Studies Volume 4, but I'm waiting for all of that material to coalesce because I want the Bible Studies volume to be 800 pages again, because that's the maximum amount that my printing company will allow. So I'm waiting to get to that point. So we'll see whenever we get there, we'll release it. But nevertheless, it's still going to be available on the website, on YouTube, Rumble, everything else. Now, I'm going to put this video as part, like I said, part of my Lord's Day series. And like I said, also that pay attention for the coming months as to how all that will shape out with the Sabbath discussion and everything else, and be really participating in the discussions around you. Don't take all this information and just sit on it, okay? The measurement of my success is whether you take action in your life or not. Because the information I'm presenting you today, and in really all of my videos in general, is very select information. Not a lot of people know about these things, especially what I'm going to be talking with you today. Very few people realize that the Didache is actually talking about the Sabbath. Imagine what that would change if people realized that John and the Didache are talking about the Sabbath when they say the Lord's Day. What would that change about our understanding of church history? It would change a lot. So more people need to know these things, and very few people are aware. So if you are aware of these things and you're taking this knowledge, do something with it. In the coming months and years, with all of the discussions that are happening on the Sabbath and the Christian Sabbath and Sunday and everything else, these things are going to be right in the front lines. So you need to know how to discuss. Now, I want to give you a disclaimer because it seems I always have to do these things when I talk about the Sabbath, unfortunately, because people are very immature and they don't learn to think narrow-mindedly. They think in dialectics, they think in denominations, they think in labels. So I am not SDA. I've never been SDA. I will never be SDA. I am not Seventh-day Adventist. I think Seventh-day Adventists are Christians. I don't think they're like Mormons. However, I think they have a lot of things wrong because of Ellen White. Ellen White is a false prophet, and I have the receipts for that. Certainly, you can do your own research and find out how she was a false prophet, how she was a plagiarist, how she was probably a Freemason or associated to Freemasonry. A lot of dubious things surrounding Ellen White. And I have a whole series on Seventh-day Adventism and the many errors that she brought into Seventh-day Adventism because of her false prophecies. And today, Seventh-day Adventists are very religious about Ellen White. Not all of them. Some of them are more distant from Ellen White and quoting her all the time. Others, they're frothing at the mouth for Ellen White, and they don't want to hear anything otherwise. She was the true light. We're the true church. Same stuff as every other harlot denomination. So my invitation to you is to get out of Babylon. And Babylon includes all of the harlot Protestant daughters of Babylon. Because to be a harlot is to say that I'm the true church, I'm the true bride of Christ, and to be special, when in fact, the only specialness you have is because of Jesus and Jesus' plan of election to bring a people to himself. And that people is from all tribes and tongues. It's everywhere. It's decentralized. There's no label. There's no denomination. That's the universal church, the true Catholic Church. So get out of the counterfeit Catholic Church and come into the true Catholic Church. SDAs have some good things, like their view on what happens after you die, some of their end times views, even though there's some issues with that. But nevertheless, they have some good things to say. They really do. And they're one of the few that are still doing research on the papacy and exposing the papacy and so on and so forth. So they get some things right, but they ultimately get caught in religion just like everybody else because of Ellen White. Now, the reason I say this is twofold. First, because I'm talking about the Sabbath. And every time I talk about the Sabbath, people are like, are you SDA? That's SDA talk. No, the SDAs don't have a monopoly on talking about the Sabbath. I'm sorry. They don't. Okay? The Sabbath has been around since creation. And the Sabbath was around much longer than the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So you don't get to be monopolizing the Sabbath when the Sabbath existed for thousands of years before your denomination. Not that the SDAs do that, but people think that if you talk about the Sabbath, suddenly you're an Adventist. And I'm not. Okay? So that's number one reason, because we're talking about the Sabbath. Number two is also because there are references in this presentation, two references that we're going to look at, that are Seventh-day Adventist references. That doesn't mean I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. That doesn't mean I go and worship Ellen White or believe what Seventh-day Adventists have to say all the time. However, because they're one of the few denominations that actually care about this topic, and they do good research on it most of the time, they have some good things to say, you have to learn to eat the meat and spit out the bones. Because that's how you learn. Nobody's going to give you the full truth. Okay, you have to be able to piece it together. Every denomination has something to offer. The Reformed have things to offer. The Adventists have things to offer. Everybody has something. You got to be able to learn to listen and cut out the weeds and get the meat out of it and piece together the puzzle, so to speak. So I'm going to be referencing some SDA sources. That doesn't mean I'm Seventh-day Adventist. Doesn't mean I believe Ellen White or anything like that. So please use discernment. Now, with that out of the way, what is the issue? Let's review the issue. I want to review the things that I discussed in that other video, because today is going to be a much deeper dive using an academic paper and some other academic things. One of the things is by a professor. He's a Seventh-day Adventist professor, but it's a topic on history. And there's another historian, Seventh-day Adventist historian, that talks about these things too. So these are very academic sources. We're going to go a much deeper dive. Now, in my response to Joe Heschmeyer in that other video, the Didache comes into view, obviously, because it's a very early document, and it refers to it mirrors John's writings, which were around that time anyway, which talk about the Lord's Day in Revelation 1. And the Didache itself is a very early document, like I mentioned. It's around 100 AD, and it mentions gathering on the Lord's Day, although some people have brought up a very valid point, which we will be discussing today, which is that the translation doesn't necessarily yield what is being read in English. So there's that also. But let's assume that the translation is completely correct. It mentions gathering on the Lord's Day. The religious narrative of Roman Catholicism, of Eastern Orthodoxy, etc., is that this proves that Christians were gathering on Sunday, every Sunday, very early on in the history of the church. And therefore, John also was talking about Sunday when he said the Lord's Day, because he was nodding to the fact that this was like the Christian thing to do at that time, so early on. That's the religious narrative. However, this is a blatant lie. It's a blatant lie, and I could prove it to you, and I've proved it to you before in the other video. We're going to prove it to you again today, hopefully. Both John and the Didache actually are talking about the Sabbath. They're not talking about Sunday at all. There are many reasons for this, and I'm going to summarize them as follows, not in any particular order. Number one, the early church was predominantly Jewish. Okay, that's a very important fact. This means that Jewish ideas, Jewish culture, Jewish ways of being, and things that were central to the Jewish identity came into early Christianity. The Sabbath, obviously, was the identifier of Israel's relationship to God, and a practice that was going on for 1,500 plus years is not going to suddenly collapse because of the resurrection. We know that Jewish culture continued into the early church for many reasons. One of them is the practice of quartodecimanism. Sounds like a really long word. It is, but it's really something very simple. It just describes people who were celebrating the resurrection on the date of Passover, 14th of Nisan. Okay? So that was a Jewish practice. It's not commanded by the Bible. It was just something that people did because they were Jews. They were practicing, celebrating the anniversary of Christ's passion on the Passover, 14th of Nisan. That was called quartodecimanism. That was a dominant way of doing things in the first century. It became an issue much later, around 180 AD and beyond, within 100 years, I think after that, 150 years. By the 4th century, they were snuffed out because they were persecuted. Why? Well, because the demographics changed. Most of the church became Gentile and pagan converts and everything else. So the demographics changed drastically. However, we know that, for example, Polycarp, who was a student of John, was a quartodeciman. And I talk about how he likely kept the Sabbath in my Lord's Day series. However, once people switched more to the Sunday Easter keeping, so this was the conflict, folks, in the first 200, 300 years of the church, one of them at least, there's many, but this is one of the conflicts, is how do we celebrate the anniversary of the resurrection? In the beginning, because they were Jews, they were doing it around Passover, okay? As the Gentiles came in and things changed demographically, you started to see more Sunday as the day of the resurrection, because that was the day that Jesus resurrected. He was viewed on the first day of the week. He rested on the Sabbath. He resurrected on the first day of the week. Okay? So the first day of the week was now held as the day of the resurrection. And there was this conflict for many, many decades, eventually with Sunday winning out over that. And again, in and of itself, it doesn't matter, right? These are not like salvation issues. They're not even like biblical. Like, it's not a big deal to celebrate the resurrection on Sunday. It's not a big deal. It's not wrong to do that. Is it wrong to have Easter eggs and bunny rabbits and all these stupid things? Yeah, those things are stupid. They're pagan. But just to celebrate the anniversary of Jesus resurrecting, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Nevertheless, that was a big controversy, especially because of other issues that I'll mention, because people didn't want to be associated to the Jews anymore. So, as the Sunday keeping of Easter became a thing, a more and more of a thing, by extension, every Sunday now started to have more and more prominence in the Christian mind, because Sunday is the day that Jesus resurrected. So now every Sunday is a memorial of that resurrection, and so that's the Lord's Day now. And you will see how this shift happened gradually. The devil was extremely cunning, extremely patient, multiple attacks of different kinds simultaneously to shape this reality. And if you're not willing to be patiently going through history with a fine-tooth comb, you're going to miss it. And that's what the devil counts on. The devil counts on you not having the patience to go through history with a fine-tooth comb. Now, I've done the work for you. All you have to do is sit back and listen, do your laundry, whatever, do some chores while you're listening. But this is what it is. You have to have patience to go through history. Most people don't. They have a TikTok brain. So you know that if you're watching my content, you don't have a TikTok brain. Thank goodness. But nevertheless, this was one of the issues, that the early church was predominantly Jewish. Okay? Keep that in mind. Quartodecimanism, at least for the first 150 years, predominantly Jewish, with Jewish culture. Point number 2, there was a massive influx of pagan converts. In the first 400 years, the demographics very rapidly changed from being mostly Jewish in the first century to mostly Gentile Christians. This resulted very quickly in new traditions, because the apostles died out, so there was nobody to shepherd the church in the right direction. So you had church fathers who were Gnostics and pagan converts with their own ideas, starting traditions like the sign of the cross, infant baptism, transubstantiation, praying for the dead, venerating relics, all the things that you see in religion today. And those are all very well documented, that they came into the church with pagan converts. So there was a mixing of truth with error. There's a lot of Gnosticism. There's a lot of philosophical influences that you still see today. A lot of pagan practices like the immortality of the soul, the Platonic soul. All these things came into the church very, very quickly. Point number 3, there was massive persecution and also deception simultaneously. During all of this stuff was happening, you had persecution of Jews against Jews, right? The Jews were the first persecutors because they were persecuting their own kind. And then eventually the Jews rebelled against the Romans. The Romans were like, you know what? We're going to start persecuting the hell out of you and your Christian, the Christians. So the Christians and the Jews were persecuted by the Romans. The Christians were at the end of the persecution of both the Jews and the Romans. That's the point. A lot of persecution. At the same time, with all of this dark persecution and pressure on you not to Judaize, not to be like the Jews, to not worship in public, to basically hide your religion, all that pressure. At the same time, you also had Gnosticism, which was from the very beginning with people like Marcion, who were seducing Christians into other ideas about Jesus, that maybe he was a spirit being, maybe he was just a man, etc., etc., etc. That the God of the Old Testament was an evil God, that Jesus really was just a good teacher to show us how to ascend to the fifth plane, this kind of stuff that's still very much alive and well today. How many people that I've still seen in my comment section, whether it's on my Jews video that went viral or whatever else, that, oh, Yahweh's actually Satan, or Yahweh's a pagan god, Yahweh's this, they were worshiping pagan gods. I'm like, same old stuff, man. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. So these things are very old. If you have anybody in your circle that believes these types of things, realize that these deceptions are very old. Nevertheless, they were very active alongside the persecution. So you had pressure from both sides. You had the dark and the light pushing on people to apostatize one way or another. Besides all that, you had a very scattered church that made it increasingly taboo to associate anything Jewish, right? So especially once the Romans started persecuting the Jews, there was increasingly more and more pressure on Christians not to look like the Jews. The early church kept the Sabbath, and the church kept the Sabbath until well into the 12th century, by the way, in different places. But the point is that the Sabbath wasn't the issue. The issue was, how do we manifest this command, this fourth commandment, because we have to keep it? How do we manifest this commandment and not look like the Jews, who are hypocrites, and also not be associated to the Jews by the Romans so that we get persecuted? It was a very, very intense test from God. And of course, the church overall failed that test because it compromised in the 4th century. But that was the test. Remember the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath. There's the Roman there with the spear, and then there's the Gnostic there with his seductive ideas, and then God is there on the narrow road saying, remember, remember, remember. And of course, these things are going to be very, very relevant to our day and age today as well. So remember that history repeats itself. I discuss all of this stuff in my 17-hour Lord's Day series in great depth. But the point is this: the early church was extremely scattered and extremely persecuted. Okay, so far what do we have? Early church was predominantly Jewish. They were persecuted, very, very scattered. And there was a massive demographic change very rapidly in the first 300-400 years. another issue on top of all of these things was the Sabbath fasting tradition that came from Rome. It's not really clear exactly when it started, but sometime in the 2nd century, right? Beginning in Rome and spreading outward for centuries onward. In fact, one of the reasons the Great Schism was started was because of the Sabbath fasting issue. That was one of the issues, because Rome was profaning the Sabbath, and the Eastern churches were keeping the Sabbath, and they didn't want to fast on the Sabbath. So this was a major issue. But it began in Rome, of course, mother of harlots, and it moved outward. And Rome was basically enforcing the Sabbath fast, although, again, you can't think of these things as happening. It's not like today where you just flip a switch and everybody's phone tells them the same thing. It was in pockets, and it grew in influence. But it began, and it was basically there to demonize the Sabbath and make it a burden and move people into this new thing that was being shaped over multiple generations. So you have the Sabbath fasting issue. You also have a gap in the record, and this is a very, very important point, something that's going to open up the discussion for today. The Didache was written sometime around 100 AD, give or take. But it does not explicitly call the Lord's Day Sunday or even mention the first day of the week. In fact, it mentions the day of preparation. So if we go to the text, here's the text of the Didache, and we can even zoom a little bit like this. Here's the text of the Didache. Okay, this is in English, obviously. So we're going to do a search for it. You can do this yourself. Sunday 0. See that? 0. How about first day? 0. Okay, so that's not in this document. What you do have, though, is preparation. Here we go. But let not your fast, this is chapter 8. Let not your fast be with hypocrites, for they fast on the 2nd and the 5th day of the week, but fast on the 4th and the preparation day, which is Friday. People were arguing, should you fast on Tuesday or Monday and Thursday or Wednesday and Friday? Even Paul addresses these issues that were plaguing the church in the beginning. Because the Jews did it one way and then people were fasting a different way. Either way, not a major issue, but you can see that they were using a term that is a Sabbath-keeping term. On the day of preparation, there is no need to use that term unless, of course, you're keeping the Sabbath. This is a imperative. This is a command. You do this and do that. Don't do this, but do that. People would understand that this is talking about a particular way of doing things, which is keeping the Sabbath. Now, it does mention the Lord's Day. Chapter 14, Christian assembly on the Lord's Day. But you have to remember that this is an English translation. Okay? And we'll get to the issues with this translation because it may not be correct. The word day here in the original language is absent. And there's debate about what this actually means. But every Lord's, gather yourself together. It could be in such a way that, you'll see, we'll get to it, but it could be like, according to the Lord's commandment, gather yourself together. Which would be very, very interesting. Because then it even strengthens the case that's already proven, very solid, that these people were keeping the Sabbath. That would be even extra evidence. I don't need it. I'm actually fine if they call it the Lord's Day, because there's plenty of evidence to prove what they mean and what John means, which is the Sabbath. But nevertheless, the translation is also an issue. So there's that. Now after the Didache, you see a gap in the manuscript record in history of about 60 to 70 years before you start to see actual evidence where the Lord's Day, the phrase the Lord's Day, is actually directly, explicitly associated to the first day of the week. So remember, up until now, there's no clear association between the Lord's Day and the first day of the week. There's an assumption that Catholics run on and the Orthodox run on when they read, oh, there's Lord's Day, gather yourself together just like we do today. No, it's not. That's not true. That's the assumption. It's not explicitly telling you Sunday or the first day of the week. There's nothing in view about that at all. So you start seeing that about 60 to 70 years after the Didache. You start explicitly seeing those things. That's true. The question is, why is there that gap? And why isn't that explicitly stated with something like John or the Didache? Unless, of course, John and the Didache were talking about the Sabbath, and then there's this gap which reveals to you that culture was shifting, and then suddenly, right around the time that Quartodecimanism was being thrown out and persecuted, because people didn't want to be like the Jews, you also start seeing a very interesting thing, which is that people explicitly start renaming the Lord's Day to Sunday. Interesting. The first mention explicitly of Sunday as the Lord's Day comes with the Gospel of Peter, which is it's an apocryphal text. It's not actually written by Peter, but nevertheless, let's read about it. Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter, or Gospel according to Peter, is an ancient text concerning Jesus Christ, only partially known today, originally written in Koine Greek. It is a non-canonical gospel and was rejected as apocryphal by the church's synods of Carthage and Rome, which contributed to the establishment of the New Testament canon. It was the first of the apocryphal gospels to be rediscovered, preserved in the dry sands of Egypt. A major focus of the surviving fragment of the gospel is the Passion narrative, which ascribes responsibility for the crucifixion of Jesus to Herod Antipas rather than to Pontius Pilate. Now, remember, before you drift into Conspiracyville, you have to remember that we have fragments as early as like the 180s, where you have the Muratorian fragment, where the church already was coalescing these various received texts that were circulating and deciding, listen, this is actually genuine, this is not. The Gospel of Peter was never universally recognized as genuinely written by Peter or Peter's disciple or whatever else. These things were rejected, not because Rome put together the Bible and took out all the books that you should have had, but rather that the church organically came to these decisions long before the 4th century and all the councils that happened in the 4th century. So watch my KJV only PSYOP series. There's a chapter in there about how we got the Bible, and you can learn more about it there. But let's keep reading. There's a little more here. Date. The gospel is widely thought to date from the composition of the 4 canonical gospels. Scholars are divided as to the exact date of the text, with some placing it in the first half of the 2nd century and considering it to have been compiled based on oral traditions about Jesus, independent of the canonical gospels. The dating of the text depends to a certain extent on whether it is the same Gospel of Peter, condemned by Serapion, Bishop of Antioch, upon inspection at Rhosus. The Rhosus community had already been using it in their liturgy. Now, really quick pause. This happened in around 180, 190 AD. So the question is, if this is the same gospel, it could not be. It could be something written even later, and they're misdating it. But again, these things are, you never have absolutes with these things, so always take everything with a grain of salt. But if it is the same gospel that Serapion was condemning, which was around 190 AD, the question is, how long was it written before that and went into circulation? Right? Did it take 10 years, 20 years? Was it written in 150 AD, 160 AD? Maybe it was written 170 AD and it circulated really quickly. Who really knows? That's the question. Moving on. John Dominic Crossan argues that the Gospel of Peter, as it is found in the modern day, was composed in the 2nd century but incorporates a passion narrative sources that predates all other known passion accounts. He calls this primitive passion source the Cross Gospel. Crossan asserts that this Cross Gospel was written before the Synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and that it influenced both them and the Gospel of Peter. Crossan's view is not accepted by mainstream biblical scholars. Craig Evans argues that the Gospel of Peter was written in the 2nd century to counter anti-Christian polemics of that time, such as the ones found in Celsus's The True Word. Later Western references, which condemn the work, such as Jerome and the Decretum Gelasianum, traditionally connected to Pope Gelasius I, are apparently based upon the judgment of Eusebius, not upon a direct knowledge of the text. So these things, there's a lot of debate on these things, but the point is, this is a relatively early work regardless. It doesn't matter who wrote it. The point is that this is written sometime at least in the middle of the 2nd century or afterwards. So we're talking at least 50 years after the Didache was written, possibly 60 or 70 years after. So you have that time frame. Now, if we look at what the Gospel of Peter says, this is the text of the Gospel of Peter. And if we zoom this out, or zoom this in rather, we're going to go to verse 35. I believe there's only one segment. Yeah, this is just one segment, but this is verse 35. But in the night in which the Lord's day dawned, when the soldiers were safeguarding it by two in every watch, there was a loud voice in heaven, and they saw that the heavens were opened, and that the two males had much radiance had come down from there, come near the sepulchre. So what is this telling you? It's telling you that when the Lord's day dawned, when the soldiers were safeguarding it by two in every watch, there was a loud voice from heaven, meaning when the angels came, said, hey, by the way, he's resurrected, that kind of thing. That's the first day of the week. This is being called the Lord's Day. This is explicitly calling Sunday the Lord's Day. Now, this is, again, as early as 50 years after the Didache, which is still a significant gap when you're dealing with these types of things. It could be as late as, let's say 70 or maybe even 80 years after the Didache, which is even more significant. But you start to see explicitly, this is not, by the way, inspired, but you start to see this writing of the Lord's Day being called Sunday, explicitly. Very, very interesting. So, Serapion of Antioch condemned this text around 190 AD. If it's the same work, then it was written around that time, a couple decades maybe earlier. Who really knows how long it would have taken to spread? It's not clear. But it is the earliest attestation of Sunday explicitly being called the Lord's Day. And, important, this Gospel of Peter is Gnostic, and it is rejected. It was rejected by the early church. So, if you're going to base the fact that Christians were gathering on Sunday from the very beginning on this would be the earliest explicit statement, then you're basing it on a Gnostic work that was rejected by the early church and condemned. So what does that tell you? Very important. Now, another resource that I want to point you to, which is a very great resource, this is the work of a man named James Andrews, his book titled History of the Sabbath. This is chapter 13. This is one of the Seventh-day Adventist sources. He's a historian from the 1800s, and very, very good book. In fact, I believe I quoted the parts of this book in my original presentation on the Lord's Day. I recall the title of the book. I think it was by the same author. It's some great information here, but nevertheless, let's read. And we're going to zoom in a little bit so we can all see what we're going through. The following is a concise statement of the testimony by which the fathers are made to prove that John used the term the Lord's Day as a name for the first day of the week. So he's outlining to you the argument that Sunday keepers present as proof that John was talking about Sunday when he meant the Lord's Day. He's outlining to you the arguments. A chain of 7 successive witnesses, commencing with the one who was the disciple of John and extending forward through several generations, is made to connect and identify the Lord's Day of John with the Sunday Lord's Day of a later age. Thus, Ignatius, the disciple of John, is made to speak familiarly of the first day as the Lord's Day. This is directly connecting the fathers and the apostles. Then the epistle of Pliny, around 104 AD, in connection with the Acts of the Martyrs, is adduced to prove that the martyrs in his time and forward were tested as to their observance of Sunday, the question being, have you kept the Lord's Day? Next, Justin Martyr, AD 140, is made to speak of Sunday as the Lord's Day. After this, Theophilus of Antioch, AD 168, is brought forward to bear a powerful testimony to the Lord's Day Sunday keeping theory. Then Dionysius of Corinth, AD 170, is made to speak to the same effect. Next, Melito of Sardis, AD 177, is produced to confirm what the others have said. And finally, Irenaeus, around AD 178, who had been the disciple of Polycarp, who had been the disciple of John the Apostle, is brought forward to bear a decisive testimony in behalf of Sunday as the Lord's Day and the Christian Sabbath. So these are the things you will hear whenever you argue with a Catholic or Orthodox apologist. So pay attention. These are the first 7 witnesses who are cited to prove Sunday the Lord's Day. They bring us nearly to the close of the 2nd century. They constitute the chain of testimony by which the Lord's Day of the Apostle John is identified with the Sunday, Lord's Day of the later times. First day writers present these witnesses as proving positively that Sunday is the Lord's Day of the Scriptures, and that the Christian Church accepts this testimony in the absence of that of the inspired writers. But the folly of the people and the wickedness of those who lead them may be set forth in one sentence. The 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 7th of these testimonies are inexcusable frauds, while the 5th and the 6th have no decisive bearing upon the case. Number 1. Ignatius, the first of these witnesses, it is said, must have known Sunday to be the Lord's Day, for he calls it such, and he had conversed with the Apostle John. But in the entire writings of this father, the term Lord's Day does not occur even once, nor is there in them all a single mention of the first day of the week. The reader will find a critical examination of the epistles of Ignatius in chapter 14 of this history. Yeah, and we'll review why Ignatius also is a forgery. It wasn't written in the time of, supposedly, if this Ignatius even existed. Number 2, it is a pure fabrication that the martyrs in Pliny's time, about AD 104, and thence onward, were tested by the question whether they had kept Sunday as the Lord's Day. No question at all resembling this is to be found in the words of the martyrs till we come to the 4th century, and then the reference is not at all to the first day of the week. This is fully shown in chapter 15. You can get this book yourself and check it out. I won't be going over that information, but nevertheless. Number 3, the Bible Dictionary of the American Tract Society, page 379, brings forward the 3rd of these Sunday Lord's Day witnesses in the person of Justin Martyr, around AD 140. It makes him call Sunday the Lord's Day by quoting him as the following, quote, Justin Martyr observes that on the Lord's Day all Christians in the city or the country meet together, because that is the day of our Lord's resurrection. But Justin never gave to Sunday the title of Lord's Day, nor indeed any other sacred title. Here are his words correctly quoted. Quote, and on the day called Sunday, all who live in the cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. Justin speaks of the day called Sunday, but that he may be made to help establish his title to the name of Lord's Day, his words are deliberately changed. Thus, the 3rd witness to Sunday as the Lord's Day, like the 1st and the 2nd, is made such by fraud. But the 4th fraud is even worse than the 3 which precede it. Number 4, the 4th testimony to the Sunday Lord's Day theory is furnished in Dr. Justin Edwards' Sabbath Manual, page 114. Quote, Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch, about AD 162, says, both custom and reason challenge from us that we should honor the Lord's Day, seeing on that day it was that our Lord Jesus completed his resurrection from the dead. Dr. Edwards does not pretend to give the place in Theophilus where these words are to be found. Having carefully and minutely examined every paragraph of the writings of Theophilus several times over, I state emphatically that nothing of the kind is to be found in that writer. He never uses the term the Lord's Day, and he does not even speak of the first day of the week. These words, which are so well adapted to create the impression that the Sunday Lord's Day is of apostolic institution, are put into his mouth by the falsehood of someone. Here are 4 frauds constituting the first 4 instances of the alleged use of the Lord's Day as a name for Sunday. Yet it is by means of these very frauds that the Sunday Lord's Day of later ages is identified with the Lord's Day of the Bible. Somebody invented these frauds. The use to which they are put plainly indicates the purpose for which they are framed. The title of the Lord's Day must be proved to pertain to Sunday by apostolic authority. For this purpose, these frauds were a necessity. The case for the Sunday Lord's Day may be fitly illustrated by that of the long line of popes. Their apostolic authority as head of the Catholic Church depend on their being able to identify the Apostle Peter as the first of their line, and to prove his authority was transmitted to them. There is no difficulty in tracing back their line to early ages, though the earliest Roman bishops were modest, unassuming men, wholly unlike the popes of after times. But when they come to make Peter the head of their line and to identify his authority and theirs, they can do it only by fraudulent testimonials. True. And such is the case with first day observance. It may be traced back as a festival to the time of Justin Martyr, around AD 140, but the day had then no sacred name, and at that time claimed no apostolic authority. But these must be secured at any cost, and so its title of Lord's Day is by a series of fraudulent testimonials traced to the Apostle John, as in the like manner the authority of the popes is traced to the Apostle Peter. Number 5. The fifth witness of this series is Dionysius of Corinth in AD 170. Unlike the four, which have been already examined, Dionysius actually uses the term the Lord's Day, though he says nothing identifying it with the first day of the week. Please keep this in mind, because this is another issue. This is the same issue with the Didache. So even when you do see the Lord's Day, are they actually meaning the first day of the week? You don't explicitly start seeing that until the 3rd century and beyond. Of course, once the 4th century kicks in, the rest, as they say, is history. Quote, "Today we have passed the Lord's Day holy, in which we have read your epistle, in reading which we shall always have our minds stored with admonition, as we shall also from what written to us before by Clement." The epistle of Dionysius to Soter, Bishop of Rome, from which this sentence is taken, has perished. Eusebius, who wrote in the 4th century, has preserved to us this sentence, but we have no knowledge of its connection. First-day writers quote Dionysius as the 5th of their witnesses that Sunday is the Lord's Day. They say that Sunday was so familiarly known as the Lord's Day in the time of Dionysius that he calls it by that name without even stopping to tell what day he meant. Oh, people were just doing this, all over the place. It was such a common thing that he didn't even have to make that association. See the equivocation? We're going to prove that wrong today. But it is not honest to present Dionysius as a witness to the Sunday Lord's Day, for he makes no application of the term. But it is said he certainly meant Sunday because that was the familiar name of the day in his time, even as is indicated by the fact that he did not define the term. And how is it known that the Lord's Day was the familiar name of Sunday in the time of Dionysius? The 4 witnesses already examined furnish all of the evidence in proof of this, for there is no writer this side of Dionysius who calls Sunday the Lord's Day until almost the entire period of a generation has elapsed. So Dionysius constitutes the 5th witness of the series by virtue of the fact that the first 4 witnesses prove that in his time, Lord's Day was the common name for the first day of the week. But the first 4 testify to nothing of the kind until the words are by fraud put into their mouths. Dionysius is a witness for the Sunday Lord's Day because the 4 fraudulent testimonials from the generations preceding him fix this as the meaning of his words. Do you get it? The only reason they're putting forward this explanation and saying, oh, this is already happening, is because they already assume, fraudulently, the previous sources all talk about Sunday, 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 but they don't. Not at all. It's all just smoke and mirrors, folks. The name the Lord's Day must have been a very common one for the first day of the week because Dionysius does not define the term. And yet those who say this know that this one sentence of his epistle remains, while the connection which doubtless fixed his meaning has perished. So we don't have the epistle to understand contextually maybe what he meant. And yet he's being forced into that context by the people who have to justify their institution. But Dionysius does not merely use the term Lord's Day. He uses a stronger term than this, the Lord's Holy Day. Even for a long period after Dionysius, no writer gives to Sunday such a sacred title as the Lord's Holy Day. Yet this is the very title given to the Sabbath in the Holy Scriptures, and it is a well-ascertained fact that at this time it was extensively observed, especially in Greece, the country of Dionysius, and that too as an act of obedience to the 4th commandment. Yeah, because the Eastern Church was keeping the Sabbath. Rome is where all of these things really began. But again, it took centuries for them to really propagate, even after Constantine. Even after the Sunday laws that they were passing, everything else, and warning people not to Judaize, that wasn't like a universal thing. It took centuries. Because remember, the Great Schism, which happened around 1000 AD with 1054, which was 900 years after Dionysius. They were still fighting about the Sabbath. So Greece is disconnected from Rome. It's on the eastern side of the world, so to speak. It's Asia Minor type of situation. So they were keeping the Sabbath very clearly so. Point number 6. The sixth witness in this remarkable series is Melito of Sardis in AD 177. The first four who never use the term Lord's Day are by direct fraud made to call Sunday by that name. The fifth, who speaks of the Lord's holy day, is claimed on the strength of these frauds to have meant by it Sunday, while the sixth is not certainly proved to have spoken of any day. Melito wrote several books now lost, the title of which have been preserved to us by Eusebius. One of these, as given in the English version of Eusebius, is, quote, on the Lord's Day. Of course, first-day writers claim that this was a treatise concerning Sunday, though down to this point no writer calls Sunday by this name. But it is an important fact that the word day formed no part of the title of Melito's book. This is another issue that is also with the Didache. It doesn't necessarily say day. It was a discourse on something pertaining to the Lord. Deperi tes kuriakes logos in Greek. But the essential word emeros, day, is wanting. In other words, it's not there. It may have been a treatise on the life of Christ, for Ignatius thus uses these words in connection. Kuriaken xoen, Lord's life. Like the sentence from Dionysius, it would not even seem to help the claim of Sunday to the title of the Lord's Day were it not for the series of frauds in which it stands. In other words, you have this entire house of cards that's built up on countless misinterpretations, twisting of the truth, and they all try to corroborate each other. But that's not exactly what's going on. All those previous sources, they're fraudulently presented. Then you get Dionysius of Corinth, who contextually, it's not clear at all what day he's talking about. And then you get Melito of Sardis, who, based on the original language, it's not even clear that he was saying the Lord's Day, but maybe the Lord's something, the Lord's command, the Lord's life. It's not clear. We don't have the context of the original language. So all these things are crafted together very craftily to present you a false narrative. Number 7, the seventh witness summoned to prove that the Lord's Day was the apostolic title of Sunday is Irenaeus. Dr. Justin Edwards professes to quote him as the following, quote, hence Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, a disciple of Polycarp, who had been the companion of the apostles in AD 167, it should be 178, says that the Lord's Day was the Christian Sabbath. His words are, on the Lord's Day, every one of us Christians keeps the Sabbath, meditating on the law and rejoicing in the works of God. This witness is brought forward in a manner to give the utmost weight and authority to his words. He was the disciple of that eminent Christian martyr Polycarp, and Polycarp was the companion of the apostles. What Irenaeus says is therefore in the estimation of many as worthy of our confidence as though we could read it in the writings of the apostles themselves. Does not Irenaeus call Sunday the Christian Sabbath and the Lord's Day? Did he not learn these things from Polycarp? And did not Polycarp get them from the fountainhead? What need have we of further witness that the Lord's Day is the apostolic name for Sunday? What if the 6 earlier witnesses have failed us? Here is one that says all that can be asked, and he had his doctrine from a man who had his from the apostles. Why then does not this establish the authority of Sunday as the Lord's Day? The first reason is that neither Irenaeus nor any other man can add to or change one precept of the Word of God or any pretense whatsoever. We are never authorized to depart from the words of the inspired writers on the testimony of men who conversed with the apostles, or rather, who conversed with some who had conversed with them. Doesn't matter what the church fathers said. What does the Bible have to say? But the second reason is that every word of this pretended testimony of Irenaeus is a fraud, nor is there a single instance in which the term Lord's Day is to be found in any of his works, nor in any fragment of his works preserved in other authors. And this completes the 7 witnesses by whom the Lord's Day of the Catholic Church is traced back to and identified with the Lord's Day of the Bible. It is not till AD 194, 16 years after the latest of these writers, that we meet the first instance in which Sunday is called the Lord's Day. In other words, Sunday is not called the Lord's Day till 98 years after John was upon Patmos, and 160 years after the resurrection, 63 years after the resurrection of Christ. So he goes on to some more things here. Though Sunday is mentioned in so many different ways during the 2nd century, it is not till we come almost to the close of that century that we find the first instance in which it is called the Lord's Day. Now keep in mind, besides these things that I'm presenting to you, we have that Gospel of Peter. it's not clear when that was written. If it's the same that Sapio, or whatever the guy's name I forget, of Antioch, Sapion, I forget his name right now, it's something like that. But anyway, if it's the same as the one that guy was rebuking, that was happening around 190 AD. So, in theory, the Gospel of Peter is actually the oldest attestation of Sunday being called the Lord's Day explicitly. The question is, how old is the Gospel of Peter? It could be around 180. It could be around 170. But either way, it's a little older than these sources, which is Clement of Alexandria, etc., etc. Nevertheless, you still see the same pattern. That around the end of the 2nd century, okay, well after the cross, well after the Didache, you start to see these things come forward. And all of the other sources are either fraudulently presented to you, like Ignatius of Antioch, we'll talk more about him today, or they're completely misrepresented. Like when Dionysius of Corinth talks about the Lord's Day, we don't have any context of what he means. Does he mean the Sabbath? Does he mean Sunday? Is he pointing to this tradition that began early? Or does he mean the Sabbath? We don't have context, but it's presented to you as, oh no, he's talking about the Sunday. Trust me, it's Sunday. But the overwhelming evidence is that he was probably talking about the Sabbath. And you have other ones that are misrepresented. They're not fraudulent, but they're misrepresented, like Melito of Sardis, where the original language, which is the same problem as the Didache, doesn't have the word day. So it's not the Lord's Day, it's the Lord's something. And in context, it might mean something else. So they're misrepresented to you as, oh, look, this is talking about Sunday, and the way we've been doing it, has been going back to the apostles, which is not true. So either the sources up until around 180, 190, when you start really seeing this explicitly, the sources leading up to that are either misrepresented, like the Didache, like John's writing in Revelation 1, like other ones that are non-inspired, like Melito of Sardis or Dionysius of Corinth. These are misrepresented. And they're presented to you as, oh, this is Sunday. Look, see, Sunday. Or they're completely fabricated, like Ignatius of Antioch. Now, Clement of Alexandria, AD 194, uses this title with reference to the 8th day. If he speaks of a natural day, he no doubt means Sunday. It is not certain, however, that he speaks of a natural day, for his explanation gives to the term an entirely different sense. Here are his words. Clement of Alexandria is very, very Gnostic. I've covered him in the series as well. But let's read. Quote, "And the Lord's Day Plato prophetically speaks of in the 10th book of the Republic." Notice how he's making Plato to be a prophet. So, tells you about his doctrine. In these words, "And when 7 days have passed to each of them in the meadow, on the 8th day they are set out and arrive in 4 days." So, again, and the Lord's Day Plato prophetically speaks of, saying, look, Plato's talking about the Lord's Day in the following. There's 7 days that pass, and on the 8th day, there's something else that happens. So he's referencing the 8th day as the Lord's Day, which is really the first day of the week if we're talking tangibly. But the argument that, what's this guy's name? James Andrews is making is that Clement, being such a Gnostic, is not actually talking about like a real day of the week. He's talking about like a metaphorical symbol situation, which is very plausible. Anyway, Clement was originally a heathen philosopher, and these strange mysticism which he put forth upon the words of Plato are only modifications of his former heathen notions. A lot of truth mixed with error with Clement, and a lot of them, because they didn't have the guidance of the apostles. They were just fending for themselves, and they were pagans trying to fit paganism and Christianity together. Though Clement says that Plato speaks of the Lord's Day, it is certain that he does not understand him to speak of literal days nor of a literal meadow. On the contrary, he interprets the meadow to represent the fixed sphere as being a mild and genial spot, the locality of the pious, which must refer to their future inheritance. The 7 days are not so many literal days, but they represent each motion of the 7 planets, and the whole practical art which speeds to the end of rest. This seems to represent the present period of labor which is to end in the rest of the saints. For he adds, but after the wandering orbs, represented by Plato's 7 days, the journey leads to heaven, that is, to the 8th motion and day. The 7 days, therefore, do here represent the period of the Christian's pilgrimage, and the 8th day of which Clement here speaks is not Sunday, but heaven itself. Here is the first instance of Lord's Day as a name for the 8th day, but this 8th day is a mystical one, and it means heaven. So in other words, to kind of simplify this, what Clement is talking about, like if I just read the whole thing, just so you have an idea of how Gnostic this is. And Plato prophetically speaks in the 10th book of the Republic in his words, and when the 7 days have passed, to each of them in the meadow, on the 8th day are set out and arrive in 4 days. By the meadow is to be understood the fixed sphere, as being a mild and genial spot in the locality of the pious, and by the 7 days each motion of the 7 planets, and the whole practical art which speeds to the end of rest. But after the wandering orbs, the journey leads to heaven, that is to the 8th motion and day, and he says that the souls are gone on the 4th day, pointing out to the passage through the 4 elements. But the 7th day is recognized as sacred, not by the Hebrews only, but also by the Greeks, according to which the whole world of the animals and plants revolves. So this is just like super, if you've read like, Stromata, Clement's Stromata, it's so full of this kind of stuff. It's just like up in the clouds, very, very Gnostic, very, very symbolic all over the place. So what he's talking about is like the general transformation of humanity from this, like, remember, the Gnostics believed you have to transcend the physical plane, okay? You have to transcend. The goal is to get to heaven. The whole goal is to get to, the spirit realm, to be one with the monad, that kind of thing. Clement is trying to fit that into like a Christian box. So he's darting around between these two belief systems. So he's seeing the 7 days of the week that are recognized, obviously, by people as a symbol of, actually there's the journey of mankind in this carnal state of physical existence. Ultimately, we're going to be redeemed and resurrected in heaven, and we're going to be, forever with God. And that's the 8th day, so to speak, metaphorically. So the point is this: he's not actually talking about like a physical practice that people were doing. Do you get it? Even this mention, if we take out the Gospel of Peter, this would be the first explicit mentioning of the Lord's Day and equating that with the first day of the week. But even this is not explicitly talking about some tradition that's happening already. It's just allegorizing and symbologizing and romanticizing Sunday as this conceptual thing of the future resurrection and heaven and all this kind of stuff. That's what it is. It's not talking about a tradition that's already happening. Look, we're meeting every Sunday, and that's the Christian Sabbath now and everything else. Do you understand? The first mention alongside the Gospel of Peter, this is like, let's say 30 years after the Gospel of Peter, they're around the same time. The first mention is not even like talking about a tradition. It's a very Gnostic thing. So moving on. But Clement uses the term the Lord's Day once more, and this time clearly as representing not a literal day, but the whole period of our regenerate life. For he speaks of it in treating of fasting, and he sets forth fasting as consisting in abstinence from sinful pleasures, not only in deeds, to use his distinction, as forbidden by the law, but in thoughts, as forbidden by the gospel. Such fasting pertains to the entire life of the Christian, and thus Clement sets forth what is involved in observing this duty in the gospel sense. Quote, he, in fulfillment of the precept according to the gospel, keeps the Lord's Day when he abandons an evil disposition and assumes that of the Gnostic, glorifying the Lord's resurrection in himself. From this statement, we learn not merely his idea of fasting, but also that of celebrating the Lord's Day and glorifying the resurrection of Christ. This, according to Clement, does not consist in paying special honors to Sunday, but in abandoning an evil disposition and in assuming that of the Gnostic, a Christian sect to which he belonged. Now, it is plain that this kind of Lord's Day observance pertains to no one day of the week, but embraces the entire life of the Christian. Yeah, so when you say like every day is the Sabbath, now we're in the New Testament, this is where it comes from, folks. It comes from Gnosticism. Clement's Lord's Day was not literal, but a mystical day, embracing, according to this, his second use of the term, the entire regenerate life of the Christian. And according to his first use of the term, embracing also the future life in heaven. So really quick pause. The first mention of it, with Plato and everything else, that was more about like the future, the rest, the Sabbath rest that we're going to have when Jesus returns, and that's the 8th day metaphorically. He's not talking about an actual day and equating it to Sunday, and that's the Christian Sabbath. He's not doing that at all. Because remember, he's a Gnostic, so he's all about over-spiritualization, metaphors, symbolism, etc., etc., etc. The second mention, he, again, like, they're all over the place. They contradict each other. They're equivocating all the time. But the second mention is using the Lord's Day more like the metaphorically, like, hey, every day is the Sabbath. And when you're, fulfilling the precept to, conquer evil thoughts or whatever, that's when you're really fulfilling the Sabbath command or whatever. It's a allegorizing of the Sabbath to mean the Christian life or the Christian future life when you're being resurrected. It has nothing, they're not even talking about a tradition to gather together on Sunday, let alone the transference of the Sabbath command, literally to rest from the seventh day to the first day. Not even in view, even though this is one of the earliest, if we take out the Gospel of Peter, one of the earliest mentions explicitly starting to associate, keep that in mind, starting to associate the Lord's Day with the first day of the week. Very important. Keep this in mind, folks. Put these on a pen so you can see how patiently the devil worked through little things here and there, little things there, shaping the culture, step by step by step. Moving on. And this view is confirmed by Clement's statement of the contrast between the Gnostic sect to which he belonged and other Christians. He says of their worship that it was not on special days, as some others, but doing this continually in our whole life. So the sect that he belonged to, they didn't keep special days. They were all about this over-spiritualization of like every day's, the rest day and everything's, of this nature. It was more allegorizing these types of things. They didn't have special days for them. Because remember, Gnostics also hated the Jews. Gnostics were very anti-Jew. A lot of Gnosticism involved splitting the Bible into two, where Jesus came to rescue you from the God of the Old Testament. So everything having to do with the Old Testament and Jewish stuff was bad. So there's that. Moving on. And he speaks further of the worship of the Gnostic that it was, quote, not in a specific place or a selected temple or at certain festivals and on appointed days, but during his whole life. So appointed days, festivals, this is not part of the Gnostic way of doing things. We're doing this thing as a whole like life type of deal. It is certainly a very remarkable fact that the first writer who speaks of the Lord's Day as the eighth day uses the term, not with reference to a literal, but a mystical day. It is not Sunday, but the Christian's life, or heaven itself. This doctrine of a perpetual Lord's Day we shall find alluded to in Tertullian, and expressly stated in Origen, who are the next two writers that use the term the Lord's Day. But Clement's mystical or perpetual Lord's Day shows that he had no idea that John, by saying the Lord's Day in Revelation 1, meant Sunday, for in that case he must have recognized that as the true Lord's Day and the Gnostics' special day of worship. In other words, if John actually meant Sunday by the Lord's Day, we should expect to see a recognition of these things in the records after John. But you don't. You don't until very, very later you start to see the twisting of the truth. Moving on, Tertullian, AD 200, is the next writer who uses the term the Lord's Day. He defines his meaning and fixes the name upon the day of Christ's resurrection. Kitto says this is the earliest authentic instance in which the name is thus applied, and we have proved this true by actual examination of every writer, unless the reader can discover some reference to Sunday in Clement's mystical eighth day. Tertullian's words are the following, quote, "We, however, just as we have received only on the Lord's Day of the resurrection, solo dia dominico resurrectionis, ought to guard not only against kneeling, but every posture and office of solicitude, deferring even our business, lest we give any place to the devil. Similarly, too, in the period of Pentecost, which period we distinguish by the same solemnity of exultation." Twice more Tertullian uses the term the Lord's Day, and once more does he define it, this time calling it the eighth day. And in each of these two cases does he place the day which he calls the Lord's Day in the same rank with the Catholic festival of Pentecost, even as he does in the instance already quoted. As the second instance of Tertullian's use of the Lord's Day, we quote a portion of the rebuke which he addressed to his brethren for mingling with the heathen in their festivals. He says the following, quote, "O better fidelity of the nations to their own sects, which claims no solemnity of the Christians for itself. Not the Lord's Day, not Pentecost, even if they had known them, would they have shared with us, for they would fear lest they should seem to be Christians. We are not apprehensive lest we seem to be heathens. If any indulgence is to be granted to the flesh, you have it. I will not say your own days, but more too, for to the heathens, each festive day occurs but once annually. You have a festive day every 8th day. The festival which Tertullian here represents as coming every 8th day was no doubt the one which he just called the Lord's Day, though he elsewhere speaks of Sunday festival as observed at least by some portion of the heathen. He here speaks of the Lord's Day as unknown to those heathen of whom he now writes. This strongly indicates that Sunday as a festival had but recently begun to be called by the name of the Lord's Day. In other words, the difference between how Tertullian refers to some people and others, based on their behavior of how they're doing this, shows you that this was just starting to become a practice around his time, which was again around the 200s. But he once more speaks of the Lord's Day as the following, quote, "As often as the anniversary comes around, we make offerings for the dead as birthday honors. We count fasting or kneeling in worship on the Lord's Day to be unlawful. We rejoice in the same privilege also from Easter to Whitsunday, which is Pentecost. We feel pained should any wine or bread, even though our own, be cast upon the ground. At every forward step and movement, at every going in and out, when we put on our clothes and shoes, when we bathe, when we sit at the table, when we light the lamps, on a couch, on the seat, and all the ordinary actions of daily life, we trace upon the forehead the sign of the cross. If for these and other such rules you insist upon having positive scripture injunction, you will find none." Thank you, Tertullian. "Tradition will be held forth to you as the originator of them, custom as their strengthener, and faith as their observer. That reason will support tradition, and custom and faith you will either yourself perceive or learn from someone who has." This completes the instances in which Tertullian uses the term the Lord's Day, except a mere allusion to it in his discourse on fasting. It is very remarkable that in each of these 3 cases he puts it on a level with the festival of Whitsunday or Pentecost. He also associates it directly with the offerings for the dead and with the use of the sign of the cross. When asked for authority from the Bible for these things, he does not answer. We have the authority of John for the Lord's Day, though we have nothing but tradition for the sign of the cross and offerings for the dead. On the contrary, he said that there was no scripture injunction for any of them. If it be asked, how could the title of the Lord's Day be given to Sunday except by tradition derived from the apostles? The answer will be properly returned. What was the origin of the offerings for the dead? And how did the sign of the cross come into the use among Christians? The title of the Lord's Day as a name for Sunday is no nearer apostolic than in the sign of the cross and offerings for the dead, for it can be traced no nearer to the apostolic times than can these most palpable errors of the great apostasy. In other words, just like how the sign of the cross and offerings for the dead and all these things started to come in the 200s and the 300s, you can't trace them to the first century church. You really can't. If you do your homework, like we're doing here, you really can't. Just like Sunday being the Lord's Day. Clement taught a perpetual Lord's Day. Tertullian held a similar view, asserting that Christians should celebrate a perpetual Sabbath, not by abstinence from labor, but from sin. Tertullian's method of Sunday observance will be noticed hereafter. Origen, in AD 231, is the third of the ancient writers who calls the 8th day the Lord's Day. He was the disciple of Clement, the first writer who makes his application. It is not strange, therefore, that he should teach Clement's doctrine of perpetual Lord's Day, nor that he should state it even more distinctly than Clement himself. Origen, having represented Paul as teaching that all days are alike, continues as the following, quote, "If it be objected to us on this subject that we ourselves are accustomed to observe certain days, as for example the Lord's Day, the preparation, the Passover, or the Pentecost, I have to answer that to the perfect Christian who is ever in his thoughts, words, and deeds, serving his natural Lord God the Word, all his days are the Lord's, and he is always keeping the Lord's Day." Now, a couple important points. Do you notice how, again, every day is the Sabbath, Jesus is my Sabbath, all the things that people say today, how they have their roots in Gnosticism. Clement, Origen were extremely Gnostic. I don't know if they're genuine Christians. Maybe they were, and they were just very deceived. They could be. I'm not saying left or right. But the point is that they had very Gnostic ideas. They did. So when you say that Jesus is my Sabbath or that every day is the Sabbath, realize that those ideas are not your own. They come from a long time ago. They've been circulated by the devil for many, many centuries. Also notice that he mentions the day of preparation. Why would he say that if people weren't keeping the Sabbath? The truth is that people were keeping the Sabbath, and they were keeping both days. They were gathering on both days, and they were resting on the 7th day. And eventually, they rested on the first day of the week, and they gathered only on the first day of the week. So anyway, moving on. This was written some 40 years after Clement had propounded his doctrine on the Lord's Day. The imperfect Christian might honor a Lord's Day which stood in the same rank with the preparation, the Passover, and the Pentecost. But the perfect Christian observed the true Lord's Day, which embraced all of the days of his regenerate life. Origen uses the term Lord's Day for 2 different days. One, for a natural day, which in his judgment stood in the same rank with the preparation day, the Passover, and the Pentecost. And 2, for a mystical day, as did Clement, which is the entire period of the Christian life. The mystical day, in his estimation, was the true Lord's Day. It therefore follows that he did not believe Sunday to be the Lord's Day by apostolic appointment. But after Origen's time, Lord's Day becomes a common name for the so-called 8th day. Yet these 3 men, Clement, Tertullian, and Origen, who first make this application, not only do not claim that this name was given to the day by the apostles, but do plainly indicate that they had no such idea. Offerings for the dead and the use of the sign of the cross are found as near to apostolic times as is the Lord's Day as name for Sunday. The 3 have a common origin, as shown by Tertullian's own words, in other words, tradition. Origen's views of the Sabbath and of the Sunday festival will be noticed hereafter. Such is the case with the claim of Sunday to the title of the Lord's Day. The first instance of its use, if Clement be supposed to refer to Sunday, is not till almost 1 century after John was in vision upon Patmos. Those who first call it by that name had no idea that it was such by divine or apostolic appointment, as they plainly show in their writings. In marked contrast with this is the Catholic festival of the Passover. Though never commanded in the New Testament, it can be traced back to men who say that they had it from the apostles. Thus the Church of Asia Minor had the festival from Polycarp, who, as Eusebius states, the claim of Polycarp had observed it with John, the disciple of our Lord, and the rest of the apostles with whom he associated. Socrates says of them that they maintain that this observance, quote, was delivered to them by the apostle John. Anatolius says of these Asiatic Christians that they received the rule from an unimpeachable authority, to wit, the evangelist John. Nor was this all. The Western churches also, with the Church of Rome at their head, were strenuous observers of the Passover festival. They also traced the festival to the apostles. I believe he's talking about Quartodecimanism now. Anyway, thus Socrates says of them, the Romans and those in the western parts assure us that their usage originated with the apostles Peter and Paul. But he says these parties cannot prove this by written testimony. Sozomen says of the Romans, with respect to the Passover festival, that they have never deviated from their original usage of this particular thing, the custom having been handed down to them by the holy apostles Peter and Paul. If the Sunday Lord's Day could be traced to a man who claimed to have celebrated it with John and other of the apostles, how confidently would this be cited as proving positively that it was an apostolic institution? And yet this can be done in the case of the Passover festival. Nevertheless, a single fact in the case of this very festival is sufficient to teach us the folly of trusting in tradition. Polycarp claimed that John and other of the apostles taught him to observe the festival on the 14th day of the first month. Yeah, this is talking about Quartodecimanism. Whatever day of the week it might be. While the elders of the Roman Church asserted that Peter and Paul taught them that it must be observed on Sunday following Good Friday. Now this, really quick pause here. The controversy around this is, did these practices begin organically? Or did Quartodecimanism come first, and then as all of these things started to change, did the practice of Sunday come and say, oh, and they just backdated it to Peter and Paul? I'm inclined to believe the second narrative, that the Quartodecimanism was the thing that came out because it's Jewish, and the early Christians were Jews, and they would have no reason to suddenly change a day like that. They would keep, in line with what they were doing. And then that came up as a later practice, and then it was justified by saying, oh, this comes from Peter and Paul, and so on and so forth. Just like as you have today, all of the writings that are presented to you fraudulently or, misrepresented to backdate Sunday all the way down to the apostles. There's nothing new under the sun. So I tend to believe the second option. I don't have absolute proof of one or the other, but I tend to believe, based on the evidence, the second option, that Quartodecimanism was the first thing that was handed down, and then eventually it got replaced by Sunday keeping. Not that I think you need to keep the Passover or anything like that, but just history is very interesting. Moving on. The Lord's Day of the Catholic Church can be traced no nearer to John than AD 194, or perhaps in strict truth to AD 200. And those who then use the name show plainly that they did not believe it to be the Lord's Day by apostolic appointment. To hide these fatal facts by seeming to trace the title back to Ignatius, the disciple of John, and thus to identify Sunday with the Lord's Day of that apostle, a series of remarkable frauds has been committed which have had occasion to be examined. But even could the Sunday Lord's Day be traced to Ignatius, the disciple of John, it would then come no nearer being an apostolic institution than does the Catholic festival of the Passover, which can be traced to Polycarp, another of John's disciples, who claimed to have received it from John himself. So this author seems to suggest that Polycarp and maybe the generation after the apostles came up with the tradition of Quartodecimanism. I'm not saying Quartodecimanism was handed down from the apostles. That's not my claim. My claim is Quartodecimanism was probably first as a tradition because the first Christians were Jews. The belief of this author is that Quartodecimanism was a tradition. Like the apostles never told you to do these things. And it was a tradition created by Polycarp. And that's probably true. I mean, it could be. I'm not claiming it either way. The point is the tradition was very quick to be established. And Sunday and Sunday keeping is a tradition of men. So, conclusion. My goodness, a lot to review on that one. But all of the evidence that Sunday apologists bring forward of the early church with the early church writings is either fabricated or misrepresented. One of the two. That's what you need to know. Either fabricated or misrepresented. They either read Sunday sacredness and Sunday Sabbath keeping backwards into these people's texts, if the people are talking about the Lord's Day, when in fact they're not defining the Lord's Day, or if you go later, like with Clement and Origen and Tertullian, they're using it very Gnostically to talk about something else, or they completely fabricate the narrative with people like Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius of Antioch was not written in the time that they claim it was written. If Ignatius of Antioch existed, he would have lived around the Didache, around 180, 105, something like that, very early on. But his writings that take his name, just like the book of Enoch takes the name of Enoch, but it wasn't written by Enoch. Many such things happen, just like the Gospel of Peter takes the name of Peter, but it wasn't written by Peter, obviously. So many things. The Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary Magdalene. These people were using other people's names to give authority to what people were reading. You got to think of it in terms of the ancient mind. People didn't have cell phones, they didn't have YouTube, okay? Even today, we do the same thing. If you want something to get attention, you want to give it some sense of authority, right? On face value so that people will indulge what you're doing. That's what they did. They took people's names and they put it on there and say, oh, look, this is the testimony of such and such. And that way it has authority and people will read it. So this is what they did. The letters of Ignatius of Antioch were written minimum in the 3rd century, like around 250 AD. And there's very clear reasons why that's the case. We'll get to them later. Justin Martyr, very, very, very pro-Sunday, very much anti-Jew, very much, talking about Sunday and whatever else, but he says nothing about Sunday as the Lord's Day. He does not call Sunday the Lord's Day one time, even though he was born after John, after the Didache was written, and he lived during the gap period between the Didache being written, around 100 AD, and all of these things that you start to see later in the 2nd century. He lived in that gap. And he was, again, very much pro-Sunday, very anti-Jew, very much would have been motivated to go with this thing and say, Sunday is the Lord's Day. We're not like the Jews. And yet he doesn't say anything. He's completely silent. That's a very big tell. Very, very big tell. Why would he be totally silent on such a huge tradition that already existed and that was central to the Christian identity? Why would he be silent on that? Why wouldn't he venerate Sunday if that was something that was already happening? And the answer, of course, is because it wasn't happening at that time. Do you get it? It wasn't happening. So it's so phenomenal when you study history. God has preserved enough truth that we can do the digging and learn the truth. He hasn't preserved all of history, and certainly he's allowed the enemy to change history and to manipulate certain facts. But God is sovereign, folks. God is sovereign. God has preserved history enough to confirm his word. And for those who are hungry for the truth, you can put together the pieces of the puzzle and see the profound movements of both God and the devil through history. and this is what we do. So the only real evidence starts coming forward with Gnostic sources. Again, even the Gospel of Peter was a Gnostic situation that was condemned. But then you had Gnostics like Clement, Tertullian, Origen. All of these things start to push on this Sunday Lord's Day thing. What does that tell you? Well, that tells you that the idea that Sunday being the Lord's Day and being reinvented, this is a Gnostic thing. So when I tell people that they're being Gnostic, when they're keeping Sunday Sabbath and they're arguing for Sunday, or Jesus is my Sabbath, or every day is the Sabbath, yeah, you're a Gnostic on this issue. It doesn't mean you believe in the demiurge or that you need to ascend and become like God. I didn't say that. But you're a Gnostic on this issue because your views are Gnostic. You're over-spiritualizing. You're relying on tradition. You're relying on metaphors and typology that doesn't exist. And you're relying on your own wisdom. And in fact, the wisdom that was false wisdom, but the things that were uttered before you with people like Clement and Origen, Tertullian. So these were pagan converts, folks. They were very misguided. Again, I don't know if they were Christians or not. I'm not going to say that they weren't. They could have been. They've just been very misguided. And God allowed them for his purposes. But they were very misguided and they were very Gnostic. And it was not for 100 years after the Didache and Revelation were written that you start to see these things. 100 years. Again, if we count the Gospel of Peter, maybe 60, 70 years, but who knows how old that really is. You could make the case that, maybe it's even older or younger than that, right? Maybe the Gospel of Peter that Serapion of Antioch was rebuking was a different one, because you have multiple copies and multiple iterations of these things going out. And so it's not clear if it's the same one. It's not clear. But if it is, okay, let's push it to 180 AD, 170 AD. Still 70 years. You have complete silence in the historical record on Sunday being the Lord's Day. Suddenly you start seeing it pop up. Profound. Now, let's talk about textual evidence. Textual evidence. If such a huge change would have happened, in other words, if God's fourth commandment would have been reinterpreted by the church, and now the Christian identity is Sunday, just like the Jewish identity was the Sabbath, now this is the Christian thing. We're reinterpreting God's laws, and we're beginning this tradition right away. This is apostolic. All the Christians need to know about this. If that happened, okay, which is what the Catholics want you to believe, and the Orthodox want you to believe, there is zero, look at it, donut hole, zero record of it anywhere in the text. We looked at extra biblical texts, right? We looked at the Didache, we looked at church father writings. Now we're going back in time to the actual New Testament. There is zero evidence in the text that such a momentous change happened. John's Gospel was written after the book of Revelation, if you didn't know that. It was written after the book of Revelation. And in John's Gospel, Sunday, of course, doesn't say the name Sunday, but the first day of the week, appears 2 times. And it's not called the Lord's Day, even though it was written after the book of Revelation. If the book of Revelation were pointing to, and John was nodding to this practice that the Christians were doing already by his time, if that was the case, why doesn't John explicitly call the first day of the week the Lord's Day in his gospel if it was written after the book of Revelation? Doesn't make sense. Don't you think that he would call that the Lord's Day? He mentions the Sabbath, but he doesn't mention Sunday as the Lord's Day. He just calls it the first day of the week. So there's no textual evidence from John. The book of Acts mentions gathering on the first day one time in Acts 20, but it mentions the Sabbath lots and lots of times. And in fact, if you count all the Sabbaths that Paul was doing his thing, there's something like 80 Sabbaths in the book of Acts, which we talked about in my Sabbath series. So one time versus 80 plus times. But when it does mention gathering on the first day of the week, this is not a tradition. Okay, in fact, if we just go to the text, I didn't pull it up, but if I can find it here, Acts 20, 20 verse 7, yeah. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them intending to depart the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. This is a matter-of-fact statement, folks. This is just to happen that, hey, when we were gathered together on the first day of the week, and we were breaking bread, Paul was doing this thing. He was talking, etc., etc., etc. Now, That's all you got. In the entire book of Acts, you ignore the fact that Paul was explicitly gathering and praying on the Sabbath, preaching on the Sabbath. They were respecting the Sabbath commandment countless times. You ignore all that. We got to focus on this one verse that says, on the first day of the week, they were gathering and breaking bread. Okay, well, in Acts 2, you got to remember, read hermeneutics, good hermeneutics, Acts 2, scroll all the way down. Let's see, fellowship of the believers. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to the prayers. Okay, so after Pentecost happens, they devoted themselves to these practices, the teachings, the breaking of bread, fellowship of the believers. Okay, how did that manifest? Well, let's see. And all came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles, and all who believed were together, had all things in common. So they shared everything. They were in joy, gratitude. It was a completely different situation than what we would ever have today. Very, very, very enlightened church in that sense. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing to the proceeds to all as any had any need. And day by day, why did my mouse just do this? And day by day, did it say the first day of the week? On every Lord's day? No, it says on day by day, meaning every day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, and they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day, again, that same phrase, those who are being saved. What is this painting for you? This painting for you a ongoing, continuous situation of fellowship, praising God, gratitude, Eucharist, Eucharisteo, gratitude, practice. Getting together, sharing things in common, breaking bread every day. Did they wait till Sunday to break bread? No, they were breaking bread every single day because they were loving each other and sharing things in common and rejoicing at the fact that God's plan had been fulfilled. That Joel 2, where God is pouring out his Spirit, we're now in the latter days. Can you imagine such a thing? The Messiah has come. They're rejoicing every single day. This is the model of the ideal church. Every day they were rejoicing. So now when you go back to Acts 20, and it says, on the first day of the week we were gathered, what is the context of that statement? Is the context the Catholic version that, there was this tradition, they were doing transubstantiation, and they were keeping Sunday holy, and all this other BS, nonsense that is not at all in the text? You have one verse, and that verse has to be interpreted in context. And that context is they were gathering every single day to break bread. This happened to be on the first day when they were gathered. Could have been on the second day when we were gathered to break bread. But it says on the first day when we were gathered to break bread. That doesn't mean they were exclusively gathering on the first day of the week. So that's all you got in the book of Acts is one time compared to, again, 80 plus Sabbaths that Paul is experiencing and preaching and praying and resting and whatever else in the book of Acts. You have one mention in the book of Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. Says, on the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. This is not talking about going to church on Sunday. In fact, this proves the Sabbath, because when he comes is on the Sabbath. Because if you look at the book of Acts, what was Paul doing? On every Sabbath, he was preaching, exhorting, debating, whatever else he was doing, and praying to spread the gospel. So that means when I come, when does he come? On the Sabbath. So, after the Sabbath, when the week begins on the first day, put aside your things and get this stuff done in the beginning so you don't delay, you don't procrastinate, so that there's no work being done when I come, and you actually have something put aside ready for when I come. Because if you procrastinate, then the week is going to pass. And then let's say Thursday comes along, Friday comes along. Oh, crap, I need to pay this debt. I'm going to take it out of this. And now you don't have anything to give. Does that make sense? So on the first day of the week, put it aside so that you reserve your best for, it's like, it kind of reminds me of the whole thing with Cain and Abel. Okay. The reason Cain was rejected wasn't because he brought vegetables. It's because there's a sense that he didn't really give his best. Okay. Reserve your best. And the same thing is with the Old Testament. Okay, if we're looking at the comparison between these two, I didn't even think about this actually with this verse, but now it makes total sense as I'm talking to you about it. In the Old Testament, the whole idea was like, give your best to the temple sacrifice. Don't give, like an injured lamb. Give your, lamb without blemish. Give the thing that's the best for you. Give the fat portion. Give all these things that are the best, because it's a physical expression of trust. so that God can reward you with a blessing. But if you reserve and you're stingy, then, that's not a good thing. Just like Cain. Do you see the same thing? Well, in the New Testament, this is the same thing being spoken to you. At the first beginning of the week, reserve something so that you have it reserved already and nothing else comes in between you during the week, because there's stuff that happens during the week. So this has nothing to do with keeping Sunday as the Sabbath. Nothing to do. It has nothing to do with some tradition that people were gathering on the first day of the week in Corinthians when it was written like 15 years after the cross. Are you kidding me? No way. No way, Jose. In fact, it proves that people were gathering together on the Sabbath and doing all these things. The other Gospels mention the first day of the week, but they never name it something. Not a single time. They never name it something. The Sabbath is highlighted to you as something special. The Sabbath has a name. The day of preparation, preparing for the Sabbath, has a name. But the first day of the week, nothing. The second day of the week, nothing. Third day of the week, nope. Fourth day, nope. Fifth day, nope. Nothing. They don't have names because they don't matter in that sense. Everything matters according to the Sabbath. So none of the Gospels have it. Corinthians is not about some weekly tradition. In fact, it supports the Sabbath. The book of Acts does not support a tradition whatsoever. It has one mention, and that mention has to be read in context of the fact that they were gathering every day, and specifically that Paul was doing lots of things on the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is a named day in the book of Acts. So that tells you that the meaning of Acts 20 verse 7 is not that there was this tradition of gathering on Sunday, but rather just a matter-of-fact descriptive statement of when they were happening to be gathered. That's all. Could have been on the second day, could have been on the third day. It happened to be on the first day of the week. Nothing special. John's Gospel, the last textual piece of evidence, which was written after the book of Revelation, does not mention the Lord's Day whatsoever, when he could have had an opportunity to do so, considering that the Catholic interpretation is that the Lord's Day in Revelation 1 is Sunday. But yet, that's not the case. So all of the textual evidence, my friends, between the Gospels, 1 Corinthians, the book of Acts, John's Gospel, specifically in relation to Revelation, there's no evidence, zero, zilch, nada, donut hole. Nothing. What do you get? What do you get when you put it all together? What you get is a big fat lie, a big fat stack of cards, house of cards, and smoke and mirrors. The devil has woven this lie very, very, very carefully for centuries, but you can see right through it if you have the diligence to use scripture and history with care. Today, most people are none the wiser, and they get dazzled by all of these Catholic and Orthodox apologists and their twisting of church father quotes and their misrepresentation of history, because they do it very confidently. But history is very, very nuanced, my friends. I hope that's one thing you learn from my channel, is that you can't make these broad claims. I mean, you can make some claims that are broad, but you have to have overwhelming evidence. History is a very, very nuanced topic, and it's very complicated. There's a lot that happened in the early church. Persecutions, mass conversions, demographic changes, dispersions, judgment on Jerusalem. People didn't have cell phones, okay? They didn't have cell phones, email, YouTube. They didn't have the internet. How would such a huge shift spread across the Christian world during these tumultuous and chaotic times? Where is the motive and motivation for a primarily Jewish audience continuing Jewish practices that are documented that they were doing, like Quartodecimanism, to suddenly do something completely contradictory to 1,500 years of their history? Where's the motivation? Especially considering the fact that they were being persecuted and they hard to communicate all the time, you had to go underground. Where's the motivation, and where would be the impetus for something like this to spread so quickly that by the time that John writes his book of Revelation, 60 years after the crucifixion, that suddenly now he's nodding to this practice that is developed in, the ancient world throughout the Christian reality? If John and the Didache meant Sunday when they say the Lord's Day, we should expect that in the 60 years from the cross to these writings, this practice of Sunday keeping would have gone out into the Christian world and have become like the thing to do. That's the Christian identity. Yet, there is zero textual evidence in the New Testament that such a change occurred. If such a momentous change occurred, my friends, ask yourself very plainly, where the hell is the evidence? Where the hell is the evidence? Where is it? Where's the evidence? There is none, which means that there is no such change. There's also zero textual evidence in the early church writings that are non-inspired after the New Testament that such a change ever occurred. In fact, the earliest that we have is beginning with the 3rd century. And then you start to generally see a lot of these changes. Quartodecimanism is being persecuted. You have Gnosticism really taking over with Clement, Tertullian, Origen, Gnosticizing the first day. You start people associating the Lord's Day to Sunday. You start people practicing Easter celebrations on Sunday. Then by extension, Sunday becomes the weekly anniversary of that. You start seeing that in the 3rd century. Absolutely. But the history from the 1st to the 3rd century, extremely complicated, extremely nuanced. Hopefully, I'm doing a decent job of making it not so complicated so you can see for yourself. But the evidence clearly and absolutely confidently shows that this practice came at least 100 years after John and the Didache, or at least 150 years after the cross. It did not happen with the apostles, and certainly not with the early 1st century church. It was part of the other compromises happening to the church, where Satan was weaving in his mystery religion to create the counterfeit that exists today in Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Again, things like transubstantiation, prayers for the dead, signs of the cross, infant baptism, relics, pick your flavor of deception. There was just been so many, right? Those things were being woven in little by little. And then eventually the counterfeit was born with its own counterfeit day of rest that you can obey the word of the devil through the pontifex when you pay your homage through obedience. So this is the issue, my friends. This is the issue. The Didache and John are not talking about Sunday as the Lord's Day. They're referring to the Sabbath. And if that's the case, the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church and harlot Protestantism are wrong. They're wrong and they are in error because the Sabbath was never changed and the early church kept the Sabbath. That is the implication of this argument. This is very well documented, and I've documented it in my series all the way up until 1100 with the Celts and Margaret and Catholicizing the Celts. The church kept the Sabbath in different parts of the world and in very large communities very well through the Great Schism. And of course, after that, the rest is truly history, but you have to learn your history and learn the truth because the Sabbath is going to be the discussion of our time. So get edified on these talking points because you're going to need them. And you're going to have to rebuttal the people that bring up church father statements and Ignatius of Antioch and Justin Martyr and Theodosian of Antioch, whatever his name is. So many people that they miscite and misquote and misrepresent. And you have to know your facts. Otherwise, people will spin your head with these types of things. Now, let's talk about the Lord's Day and the Didache. Now that we have all of that out of the way, I want to present to you a paper by another man named Dr. Frank W. Hardy. He's also a Seventh-day Adventist. He's a scholar, and he presents some very compelling arguments to supplement everything we've been discussing already. Arguments that I have not come across. They're very new, very, very interesting. I didn't even think about this, and it's such a brilliant truth, such a brilliant thing. So I want to present it to you. They're very nuanced, but I think they're also very clear and obvious once you see them. So I think it's going to be edifying, and I hope it's going to be edifying, especially as this issue becomes more pressing in our culture. Now, I'm going to break this into chunks as we go through the paper, and we will comment as we go. So this is The Lord's Day in the Didache by Frank W. Hardy, PhD. And I guess I can zoom. I can zoom in. Let's see. Zoom. That's a little bit too, well, can I get it just right? All right. So, introduction. The Didache nowhere uses the word Sabbath, but it does use the expression Lord's Day, as we see in the above passage from chapter 14 in regards to the other parts of the Ten Commandments. The Didache gives quite a list. Here I quote chapter 2. Let me just make this a little bit. Here we go. And the second commandment of the teaching. This is quoting the Didache now. You shall not commit murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not commit pederasty. You shall not commit fornication. You shall not steal. You shall not practice magic. You shall not practice witchcraft. You shall not murder a child by abortion or kill that which is begotten. You shall not covet the things of your neighbor. You shall not forswear yourself. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not speak evil. You shall not bear. You shall bear no grudge. You shall not be double-minded nor double-tongued. For to be double-tongued is a snare of death. Your speech shall be not false, nor empty, but fulfilled by deed. You shall not be covetous, nor rapacious, nor a hypocrite, nor evil disposed, nor haughty. You shall not take evil counsel against your neighbor. You shall not hate any man, but some you shall reprove. Concerning some you shall pray, and some you shall love more than your own life. The commandments we find here are drawn from the entire second table in a model where number 5 belongs with the first table rather than the second. In addition, there are some commandment lookalikes. So we find number 6, murder, something that resembles number 6, abortion, and number 7, adultery, and 2 things that resemble number 7, like pederasty and fornication. Number 8, stealing. Number 9, lying. And something that resembles number 9, evil speaking. Number 10, coveting. And something that resembles number 10, being covetous. The author of the Didache is very much at home with the idea of obedience. Why? Because they were Jews. There is nothing here about allegorical interpretations or spiritualizing the commandments. More than just meeting the commandments head on, the author adds some of his own for good measure just to make sure people catch the point. The Didache comes from an extremely early period of church history. As such, we can't automatically assume that the Lord's Day meant then what it means now, or even that it would mean in the 2nd century. I argue here that when the church first started using this term, it was a Christian code word for the Sabbath, and that was later adapted for use with another day as the Christian day of worship gradually shifted from the 7th day to the 1st. The key word here is gradual. The day of worship at first was very clearly the Sabbath. So, conclusion with that part, the same points we discussed previously in the previous sections. It's very clear that the early church was Jewish and had Jewish influences, and you can see that in the writing style of the Didache. There's very much emphasis on obedience, commandments, the moral code, the day of preparation, etc., etc. Of course, that Jewish connection, you'll see there's other Jewish connections too, like the 2 ways in the beginning. That Jewish connection is going to be downplayed as much as possible by the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox because they are trying to appropriate something that was essentially a Jewishly inspired document by a Jewish Christian community, to their Roman Catholic narrative and say, no, this is actually what it's saying. Because the Roman Catholic narrative is that the Sabbath is just a Jewish thing and, Christians didn't do that and whatever else. But of course, if it can be proven that these precious early documents that they love to cite actually support the Sabbath, then their entire institution falls to pieces. So, anyway, that's the point. So basically, there's a lot of influence, Jewish influence, and we can tell from many textual clues that there's desire for obedience, the 10 Commandments, the day of preparation, etc., etc. So very likely the Sabbath is also in view when we're talking about the Lord's Day. Now, the next section is titled The Apostles and the Lord's Day. This part is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I didn't even consider this, but you will delight in this, hopefully. Consider the following facts. In Acts 4:14 and 21, the Jewish leaders didn't know how to punish Peter and John. If these disciples had been Sabbath breakers, the leaders would have known how to punish them. In Acts 5:15, people put their sick out on the street where Peter and his companions were known to pass by so that their shadow would fall on them and they would be healed. The level of esteem in which the disciples were held by the people of Jerusalem at this time can't be accounted for under the hypothesis that they had stopped keeping the Sabbath. In Acts 6 verse 7, a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. There's no indication that when these men became Christians, they stopped being priests. Number 4, the rapid growth of the church in general during the 3.5 years or so between the cross and the death of Stephen in a solidly Jewish environment argues against anything remotely resembling a change of the day of worship. So just to review these points, okay? The first point is that when the leaders were persecuting Peter and John, they were debating on how to punish them, okay? First off, they had motive, okay? This is a major thing to understand. Who were the first persecutors of Christians? Jews, because the first Christians were Jews. So the Jews that didn't convert, that were stubborn and hard-hearted and Pharisees, they were the first persecutors. They were persecuting their own kind. Now, the Jews, like the Pharisees, had every reason to accuse them, like with all the law and legal things that they were obsessed with, right? They had lots of motive to accuse them so that they could be killed and stoned to death or whatever else. And yet, when you see these situations with Peter and John, and the persecutions like with Stephen and whatever else, they are never accused of breaking the Sabbath. They're never accused of breaking the Sabbath. That is an incredibly meaningful detail that, if you understand why that's meaningful, it destroys this entire idea that this Sunday keeping stuff is an apostolic tradition. Because if the apostles said, hey, we're doing this thing on Sunday now in honor of Jesus, and this was the early church's thing, then that would have been such low-hanging fruit for the Pharisees to say, oh, well, look, they're teaching people to break the Sabbath with this whole Christian thing. They're teaching people to break the Sabbath. How people think the book of Hebrews is actually teaching people. Like in Hebrews 4, oh, he's redefining the Sabbath, or now every day is the Sabbath or whatever else. Are you kidding me? Hebrews is written to Jews on the fence. The last thing on the earth that the author of that letter would ever include in his letter as a selling point to push people over the edge and have them convert to the truth. The last thing he would say is, look, that Sabbath thing that God was really pissed off about when you didn't do it and profaned it over these last 1,500 years, you don't have to do that anymore. You have to worry about it. Come do this Jesus thing, and every day's your Sabbath. Are you kidding me? Not in a million years. But that's what people think because they're ignorant and they've bought the Kool-Aid on all these things. So the point is that in these persecutions, not a single time are they accused of breaking the Sabbath. Would there be motive? Absolutely. Would they have knowledge? Yeah, because they're Jews. They know they're keeping track of these things. They brought false witnesses before them. Not a single time were they accused, meaning they did not break the Sabbath and they kept the Sabbath. The other point is that people would have very high esteem of, Peter, like when he was walking through Jerusalem. They were in Jerusalem and people were like, oh, please heal me, please heal me. These are Jews, okay? These were Jews. They weren't yet believing Christians. They're just people getting healed. I'm sure many of them ended up believing. But the point is that they were held in high regard by the people. But if they were Sabbath breakers and teaching people to break the Sabbath and to do this new Sabbath on Sunday, they would have not been held in high regard. That would have been too controversial. Are you kidding me? That would have been way, way too controversial. So it never happened. The other thing is with the priests in Acts 6 or 7. They were priests. They were Jewish, not only just Jewish, but they were also priests. And they converted. Did they stop being priests? No. That means they didn't stop keeping the Sabbath. They were involved in the religious practices, the spiritual practices. And of course, the final point, the rapid growth of the church in general during the 3.5 years or so between the cross and the death of Stephen, in a solidly Jewish environment, argues against anything remotely resembling a change of the day of worship, which is exactly the point that I've been reiterating to you. Moving on. In his trial in Acts 7, notice that the council sat in silence while Stephen recounted the course of Jewish history, including his point that Moses was the type of Christ. A turning point came, however, when he said the following: "You stiff-necked people with uncircumcised hearts and ears, you are just like your fathers. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your fathers did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And now you have betrayed and murdered him. You who have received the law that was put into effect through angels, but have not obeyed it." Oof. This is a really, really sharp sting against them not keeping the law as it was intended. Now, recall that in chapter 6, Stephen's accusers produced false witnesses who testified this fellow never stopped speaking against this holy place and against the law. So they produced false witnesses to try to incriminate Stephen. Now the accused becomes the accuser. So Stephen is speaking, and he lays down the accusation against them. The law that was put into effect through angels is a transparent reference to the Ten Commandments, and now Stephen accuses the Jewish nation, prominently including its leadership seated before him, of disobedience and apostasy. It would be a mistake to place this on the same level as his earlier references to Israel's rebellion in the wilderness. Mention of past failings could be tolerated. In other words, he had a whole speech, and in that speech he mentions a lot of things about Israel's past failures. But now he's making it real, like you are stiff-necked, you are disobeying God, you are basically the rebels here, the ones that need to be accused. So he's making it personal in the present moment. In saying what he did, however, Stephen was no longer describing past failings. He was addressing the court directly. In effect, Stephen accuses his judges of being less faithful to the law than he was. They were trying him, but were more guilty than he was. No one stood up at this point to say, "You can't make that claim, it's unfair because we keep the Sabbath but you don't." If such a change had been possible, Stephen's trial would have come much sooner and much shorter. The fact that he lived long enough to appear before the Sanhedrin at all, in fact, the fact chapter 7 is part of the book of Acts, is evidence that Stephen was a Sabbath keeper. In the 3.5 years leading up to AD 34, did Stephen have one rule of faith and practice and the apostles another? The fact that only Stephen was brought into court argues strongly that the other leaders of the church were also Sabbath keepers, just as he was. If Sabbath breaking was an actionable offense, and if in that context the Sanhedrin brought no charge against the apostles, it follows they were unable to do so. They were unable. The will was there, but not the ability. I submit that the apostles kept the Sabbath holy, just like all the other Jewish people around them. If this had not been their rule, they would have been stoned long since by the people, quite apart from the Sanhedrin. They would have been killed by their own kind, long before all this stuff happened, if they were breaking the Sabbath and they were teaching people to do so. That would have been very clear. And especially when Stephen is put on trial and he's accusing the Sanhedrin of basically being hypocrites with the law. Do you think that his accusation would have any power if he had been breaking the Sabbath and doing this Christian Sunday thing and teaching other Christians like, oh, this is now the true Sabbath is the Sunday, the first day of the week, because Jesus resurrected? No, not at all. They would have immediately accused him and said, look, how can you, being a Sabbath breaker, accuse us of breaking the law? No such thing exists. Why? Because Stephen kept the Sabbath, and that means that everybody else kept the Sabbath, because they wouldn't be doing two different things. After the martyrdom of Stephen. There is a question, is this in the segment? Yeah, this is. Okay. There's a question, what happened after AD 34? On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church of Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Many of the apostles eventually also left. Peter and John traveled through Samaria. Peter went to Lydda, Joppa, and Caesarea. He returned to Jerusalem, where he was imprisoned by one of Herod's sons and set free by an angel. He then went elsewhere. We know that Peter eventually made his way to Antioch because that's where he was when Paul opposed him to his face. Other disciples went farther than this. Philip is said to have gone west to North Africa. In Carthage, Matthew south to Ethiopia, Andrew north to Ukraine or even Russia, Thomas east to India. John became the leader of the church in Ephesus in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. Not all of the apostles left Jerusalem. James apparently remained for the duration as the leader of the mother church in Jerusalem. And I believe James was killed in Jerusalem also. No one can successfully claim that the apostles failed to keep the Sabbath while in Jerusalem. All of the evidence we have points to their keeping it faithfully. Nor will it do to say that they kept the Sabbath when surrounded by Jews, but not among Gentiles. The apostles did not have a double standard, one for public consumption and another held privately. If they erred at all, it was in being slow to appreciate the needs of the Gentile converts. The Jerusalem church was always a bastion of strict observances and law-keeping among the Christians. This attitude comes to the surface in a number of passages. For example, this is Acts 21, 20-24. When they heard this, they praised God, and they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all of the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know that there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law." Consider also that James addresses his epistle to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. So the point of these previous verses in Acts 20, verse 20-24 is that law-keeping was very, very important in Jerusalem. That's the point, okay? It's very clear these people cared about keeping the law. They didn't want, the last thing on their minds would be to not keep the Sabbath. That would be like very like a nightmare that somebody would be teaching you to do that. You could be stoned to death, very, very painful death. So nobody was about to break the Sabbath, okay? And especially teach others to break the Sabbath. Next portion. Consider also that James addresses his epistle to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. He was not writing to Jews. The first part of his salutation says, James, a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ. Instead, he is asserting that Christians are a spiritual Israel to God. This is how the entire community saw itself. F.F. Bruce comments as follows, quote, the ringleader of the Christians escaped their hands by his appeal to Caesar, but the central Nazarene community lay within their jurisdiction there in Jerusalem. Yet little fault could be found with them. They were humble, pious, and patriotic Jews, led by a man named James, whose asceticism and holiness of life won him the esteem of all who knew him. So they were being, the Pharisees and the political interests were looking for every excuse under the sun to persecute these people. However, they also were held in high regard by their fellow Jews. So it's very nuanced. If they were breaking the Sabbath and they were teaching other people to do this thing, or Jesus is your Sabbath now, don't worry about it. Can you imagine what would have happened to them? Certainly not what we read. Until manuscript evidence comes to light with an apostolic statement to the effect that the original 12 kept another day after Jesus' death, I challenge that they did. That they did not, maybe. The apostles kept the seventh day. I challenge that they did keep it. In other words, I challenge this idea that Sunday was kept by the apostles, which they didn't keep Sunday. The apostles kept the seventh-day Sabbath to the day of their respective deaths. Some will ask, if the Sabbath was so important, why didn't Jesus rise from the tomb on that day? The answer does not have to do with its importance, but with its significance. The word Sabbath means cessation or rest. Christ continued to honor the Sabbath in death, as he always had in life, by resting on it. My question, countering the first, is, if the Sabbath were so unimportant that it could be set aside, why didn't God tell us so? He gives the Sabbath amid thunder and lightning and abolishes it without so much as a whisper. Yeah, when the Ten Commandments were laid down, remember God appeared on the mountain with fire and lightning, people trembled. So he revealed his sense of morality and justice and perfect character under fire and lightning and burning wrath. And supposedly he abolishes one of the commandments or transfers it or gnosticizes it without so much as a whisper. That's interesting. There is no thus saith the Lord to support the popular view. If God set the Sabbath in place, he is the only one who can annul it. He hasn't done that yet. Until he does, the Sabbath remains. As for the apostles, their position was the same as the one I have just expressed. Peter and the other apostles replied, we must obey God rather than men. Yeah, why? Because they were Jews who cared about obedience. Not that you're saved by obedience, but they cared about obedience because obedience shows that you're genuinely a believer. There were ceremonial Sabbaths, and these fell away at the cross, but this is because Christ was the reality to which they pointed forward. The weekly Sabbath pointed forward to nothing. On the contrary, what the commandment says is remember the Sabbath day. I would argue that the weekly Sabbath points to eternity, and that's one reason why it hasn't been done away with, because just like marriage, pointing to eternity, marriage is still part of the human experience. It hasn't been done away with as of the cross. You're not required to get married and have children, but it hasn't been done away with as an institution because it points to eternity. It has an already not yet component. Anyway, which part of the remember looks forward to a future event? If it doesn't, it can be displaced by a future event. What could nullify or displace your birthday? Even when people die, it is still the case that they were born on a certain date. People celebrate Mozart's birthday on January 17th, 1756. And if we're all here 10 years from now, they'll still be doing it. Nothing he did later or that we have done later can change the fact that he was born when he was born. So how could anyone change the memorial of God bringing the world into existence? The Sabbath is the birthday of the world, celebrated on a weekly cycle. Nothing can change that. Yeah, and please see my video on Saturday is the Sabbath that documents for you very clearly that the seventh day that we call Saturday, doesn't matter what we call it, but we call it Saturday. It is the continual seventh day from the beginning of creation, which is a profound thought. Very, very profound. So conclusion, these are very, very nuanced, but extremely powerful scriptural clues. The New Testament documents persecution of the apostles by their own Jewish brethren. It also documents the relationship of the apostles in Jerusalem and how people were basically longing to be healed by them and things of this nature. There were receptive people and there were people that were trying to persecute them as well. So it's two sides. The persecuting people, the Jews who came with the false witnesses and accusations, they tried everything under the sun to persecute them and to basically condemn them. They had 1,000% motivation to destroy these people's lives. And yet there is zero accusations that the apostles broke the Sabbath or that Stephen broke the Sabbath. Zero. When in fact there would be nothing but pure motivation given the context, especially when Stephen was accusing them to their face that they're not keeping the law. Can you imagine such a thing? This is phenomenal evidence that these people kept the Sabbath, in conjunction with all of the other previous textual clues, where you have the absence of any Sunday keeping practice. Had early Jewish Christians switched to a new day, this would have created a major, major conflict, and this conflict would have been extremely obvious, especially in Jerusalem, where people were very concerned about law keeping. It would have been very obvious, and it would have been documented in the New Testament. It would have been documented to some degree in the New Testament, yet the New Testament is silent on any such practice developing, and it's silent on the apostles or disciples being persecuted for not keeping the Sabbath. In other words, there is absolutely zero evidence for the Sunday keeping belief being an apostolic origin, because it's not. You have key textual evidence now that shows you the Jewishness of the church, their focus on obedience, their concern for God's laws. That doesn't mean, again, that you're saved by obedience, but those who have no concern for God's laws cannot be considered Christians, right? If you have no concern for morality, how can you be called a Christian? If you have a concern to be moral and to obey the Ten Commandments because they're good, then you have a regenerate heart. Does that mean you're saved by your obedience? No, because there's grace for your failure. But you have to struggle. If you're not struggling inside and saying, man, I wish I could do better. I hate the fact that I'm doing these things. Just like Paul says, wretched man that I am, I do the thing that I don't want. He was internally conflicted. Why? Because Paul knew that a regenerate heart leads to obedience. Even though Paul talked a lot about being justified by faith. Yeah, he did. But he also mentions the law in a positive light. And we talk about that in the various series. Now, moving on to the next section. This is the relationship. We skip this part, but we go to this next part, which is relationship of the Didache to Jewish sources. Some scholars below believe that the Didache drew on Jewish sources. Another major source was the Gospel of Matthew. Are these two sources compatible with each other? The author apparently thought they were. The Didache is definitely Christian in its final form, and yet it contains points of contact with Jewish thought. Quote, it is held by many critics that the two ways, this is in the very beginning, it's a section in the Didache, the two ways, like the way of life, the way of death, is older than the rest of the Didache and is in origin a Jewish work, intended for the instruction of the proselytes. The use of the Sibylline oracles and other Jewish sources may be probable, and the agreement of chapter 2 with the Talmud may be certain. But on the other hand, Funk has shown that, apart from the admittedly Christian chapters 1 and the occasional citations of the New Testament, the Old Testament is often not quoted directly, but from the Gospels. Bartlett suggests an oral Jewish catechesis as the source. But the use of such material would surprise us in one whose name for the Jews is the hypocrites. Remember when he talks about the fasting, let not your fasting be like the hypocrites? He's talking about the Jews. So he's talking about the Jews that are not converted. And in the vehemently anti-Jewish Barnabas, still more. The whole base of this theory is destroyed by the fact that the rest of the work, though wholly Christian in its subject matter, has an equally remarkable agreement with the Talmud in various sections. Beyond doubt, we must look upon the writer as living at a very early period when Jewish influence was still important in the church. He warns Christians not to fast with the Jews or pray with them, yet the two fasts and the 3 times of prayer are modeled on Jewish custom. Similarly, the prophets stand in the place of the high priest. The part of the Didache of the greatest interest here is not the two ways of chapters 1 through 5, but the oblique reference to worship in chapter 14. This chapter, quoted at the beginning of the present paper, is only 3 verses long. I repeat it here for the reader's convenience. On the Lord's day of the Lord, kata kuriaken de kurio, come together, break bread, and hold Eucharist, after confessing your transgressions, that your offering may be pure, But let none who has a quarrel with his fellow join in your meeting until they be reconciled, that your sacrifice may not be defiled. For this is that which was spoken by the Lord. In every place and time offer me a pure sacrifice, for I am a great king, saith the Lord, and my name is wonderful among the heathen. The Greek words kata kuriaken de kurio raise more than one question for the translator. First, how should kata with the accusative be understood? Does it mean on, as it would with a noun describing time? Or does it mean according to, as it would with a noun describing fitness, reference, or conformity? Only context can decide such issues. In the first case, on is an acceptable rendering. But does the governing noun in the above phrase have to do with time? Actually, there is no governing noun. What follows is an adjective, kuriaken. This brings us to our second question. What does kuriaken de kurio mean? Literally, these words say, the lords of the Lord. What does that even mean? Kearsarge Lake inserts the word day after kuriaken, which makes it appropriate to translate kata as on. Thus, on the Lord's day of the Lord. With equal correctness, we could translate according to the Lord's, in parentheses, command of the Lord. Here, the meaning could be celebrate the Eucharist according to the Lord's instruction. So do you see the issue here? The word day is not included. And this preposition, kata, could be either on or according to, depending on the context. And the problem is that these words, kuriaken de kurio, is on the lords of the Lord. What are we talking about? Are we talking about days? Are we talking about instruction? Are we talking about command? It's not really clear. But if you insert the word day there because that's what you think it means, then kata becomes on, and then you have a whole statement of on the Lord's day. But what if it's not saying that? What if it says according to the Lord's command, or according to the words of the Lord and the instructions of the Lord? Could say that. It could actually not even be dealing with the Sabbath or any gathering. It could just be something to deal with something else, with the breaking of the bread, which is what they were doing. So it might not even be dealing with the Sabbath or the Lord's day, like the phrase the Lord's day at all. Nevertheless, the words we've been wrestling with, kata kurio and de kurio, have a vague similarity to te kuriake hemera, commonly translated on the Lord's day in Revelation 1 verse 10. But the two phrases are not identical. One problem with translating Lord's day in Didache 14 is that the text doesn't include the word day. Elsewhere in the paper, I accept the popular gloss Lord's Day for discussion, suggesting that it refers to a day but not to Sunday. If the reference is to time in Didache 14, it would almost certainly refer to the Sabbath, following the biblical formula that the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, Mark 2 verse 28. Even if the Greek of the Didache really does mean Lord's Day, which needs to be established rather than taken for granted, it would also need to be established that the Lord's Day in the late 1st century means Sunday. In view of Revelation 1 verse 10, Matthew 12 verse 8, Mark 22 verse 28, and Luke 6 verse 5, this is most unlikely. Yeah, it is, because of all of the things we've been discussing. So, conclusion. These are very obvious proofs that the Jewish influences of the Didache are very real. They're connected to Jewish culture. Obviously, there were some conflicts with the Jews at that time because there were Jews that were persecuting their own kind, but nevertheless, there's still a lot of evidence that there's a lot of Jewish influence. These things confirm the historical narrative that the early church was predominantly Jewish, and they had zero motive to change a 1,500 plus year practice into something so drastic that it would cause, major conflict and confusion. The original language of the Didache also leaves room for questioning the translation, because the word day is not there. Meaning it could be according to the Lord of the Lord. What does that mean? According to the command of the Lord, according to the word of the Lord. What does it mean exactly? Which in that case would be even more preferential for the Sabbath or some sort of command. But nevertheless, given the fact that there's the Ten Commandments being brought in to the document, there's Jewish influence in the writing that we looked at, there's a sense of obedience, there's the concern for all these things, there's the day of preparation. I think that interpreting the Sabbath there, either way, is very easy and natural, and it's very consistent with the evidence. Nevertheless, the current translation is not a bad translation, so I'm not saying it's a mistranslation. It's just not 100% absolute either, and this is the problem. This is the problem. So Sunday keepers have to absolutely first prove that this is the Lord's Day being discussed here, when it could go another direction. Could not even be dealing with any days. It could just be dealing about breaking bread or the instructions or whatever that are being cited there. So they have to prove that. And then the harder thing to prove is that if it does say the Lord's Day, then that the author, who was a Jewish Christian in a predominantly Jewish Christian church that was talking about the Ten Commandments, the Day of Preparation, very influenced by Jewish practices, etc., all the things we're talking about. You have to prove, if it does mean the Lord's Day, you have to prove that the author, who's Jewish Christian, meant Sunday and not the Sabbath. Good luck, because you can't. You can't prove it because they meant the Sabbath. If it is the Lord's Day, then they meant the Sabbath, very clearly so. So this is the problem. Now, let's talk about the Epistle of Barnabas. There is a question about the date of the Epistle of Barnabas, just as there was for the Didache. I suggest that it comes from about the same time of Hadrian. Scholars debate which comes first and which quotes the other. The other thing we can be sure of is that one writer or the other is doing some quoting. We don't know with certainty which one, but I suspect that it was the author of Barnabas. Barnabas 4, Didache 16 verse 2, and Barnabas 4 verse 9 both express the thought that having faith for only a while is not enough. We must endure to the end. And the quote goes like this: "But we frequently gather together, seeking the things which are profitable for our souls. For the whole time of your faith shall not profit you, except ye be found perfect at the last time." That's Didache 16. Now Barnabas 4 verse 9 says, "And although I wish to write much, I hasten to write in devotion to you, not as a teacher, but as it becomes one who loves to leave out nothing of that which we have. Wherefore, let us pray heed in the last days, for the whole time of our life and faith will profit us nothing unless we resist, as becomes the sons of God in this present evil time, against the offenses which are to come, that the black one may have no opportunity of entry." Barnabas 18 through 20. The Didache begins with the discussion of the two ways. The same topic is discussed in Barnabas 18 through 20. Isolated words or phrases parallel in the Greek lie scattered here and there, but the clearest parallel is the one from the introduction to the topic of the two ways. Didache 1 verse 1, "There are two ways, one of life, one of death. There is a great difference between the two ways." Barnabas 18 verse 1, "There are two ways of teaching and power, one of light and one of darkness. There is a great difference between the two ways." Notice the Didache speaks of life and death, while the Epistle of Barnabas speaks of light and darkness, but this minor variation is not a difference. The concept and terminology of the two ways is borrowed, in my view, by the Epistle of Barnabas from the Didache, and according to some scholars by the Didache from an earlier Jewish source. If the ultimate source is Jewish, it has been well covered with references, especially to the Gospel of Matthew, especially in Didache 1 through 3. Barnabas 15. Barnabas chapter 15 is entitled The Sabbath. It is of interest that Sunday is not called the Lord's Day in Barnabas. Instead, it is called the 8th day. Now, the Epistle of Barnabas, which again is a Gnostic text, it was written after the Didache. And again, notice the same thing, that it doesn't explicitly call Sunday the Lord's Day, it just says the 8th day, because the Gnostics love their 8th day. But again, nothing explicit. This is an early term which falls away when the expression Lord's Day stops meaning Sabbath and starts meaning Sunday. I leave for future research the question whether and to what degree the terms 8th day and the Lord's Day are used in parallel within the same documents. My hypothesis is this would not happen frequently, i.e. that a given writer would choose one term or the other. Barnabas 18 says, "Furthermore, it was written concerning the Sabbath in the 10 words which he spoke on Mount Sinai face to face with Moses, sanctify also the Sabbath of the Lord with pure hands and a pure heart. And in another place he says, if my sons keep the Sabbath, then will I bestow my mercy upon them. He speaks of the Sabbath at the beginning of the creation, and God made in 6 days works of his hands. On the 7th day he made an end, and rested in it and sanctified it. Notice, children, what is the meaning of he made an end in 6 days. He means this, that the Lord will make an end of everything in 6,000. Pay attention to this part, okay? This is very, very big clue about what this is all about. He means this. So now there's the commentary on the creation week. That the Lord will make an end of everything in 6,000 years. for a day with him means as 1,000 years. And he himself is my witness when he says, lo, the day of the Lord shall be as 1,000 years. So then, children, in 6 days, that is in 6,000 years, everything will be completed. And he rested on the seventh day. This means that when his son comes, he will destroy the time of the wicked one and will judge the godless and will change the sun and the moon and the stars. And then he will truly rest on the seventh day. Furthermore, he says, thou shalt sanctify it with clean hands and a pure heart. If then anyone has the present and the power to keep holy the day which God made holy by being pure in heart, we are altogether deceived. See that we shall indeed keep it holy at that time when we enjoy the true rest, when we shall be able to do so because we have been made righteous ourselves and have received the promise, when there is no more sin, but all things have been made new by the Lord. Then we shall be able to keep it holy because we ourselves have been first made holy. Furthermore, he says to them, your new moons and your Sabbaths I cannot away with. Do you see what he means? The present Sabbaths are not acceptable to me, but that which I have made, in which I will give rest to all the things, make the beginning of an eighth day, that is the beginning of another world, where we also celebrate the gladness of the eighth day, in which Jesus also rose from the dead and was made manifest and ascended into heaven. Okay, we'll talk about this once we finish, because there's a lot to talk about. Just keep that in mind. Notice that the argument in Barnabas is primarily an argument against the Sabbath, rather than in favor of Sunday. The author doesn't want to keep the Sabbath because he is not pure in heart, and suggests strongly that the same is true of all his readers. As William H. Shea insightfully points out, the fourth commandment in Barnabas is not fulfilled and done away with. It is unfulfilled and yet future. Very, very clever. I want you to see how clever the devil is. Extremely clever. Remember the time that this letter occurred, which was between the Didache and, all the Gnostic things you start seeing in the 3rd century. So it's in transition. It's a transition fossil. So Barnabas is not wrestling with the question whether the Sabbath is still holy. It is. Or whether it has a valid claim on human obedience. It does. The problem is not with the Sabbath at all, but with those who wish to keep it, since no one is pure enough or holy enough to do so. Keeping the Sabbath holy is not something that the writer dismisses, but merely defers until a later world age or 1,000-year period. See that we shall indeed keep it holy at that time. This is a significant argument on the writer's part. When we understand it, we will have a better idea why he avoids using the expression the Lord's Day to describe Sunday. He doesn't make such a connection because he has no thought of replacing the Sabbath. Similarly, he has no thought of instituting Sunday worship. Wherefore we also celebrate with gladness the eighth day, in which Jesus also rose from the dead and was made manifest and ascended into heaven. Notice that the above sentence has a main clause and a subordinate clause. The main clause says, wherefore we also celebrate with gladness the eighth day. Having reported this fact, the subordinate clause adds that this is the day in which Jesus also rose from the dead and was made manifest and ascended into heaven. He does not appeal to divine authority or human authority, nor does he seek to replace the Sabbath with another day. He doesn't want to be encumbered with keeping it. He points out that the eighth day, Sunday, is celebrated with gladness, but this is not presented as an obligation. The fact that the author of Barnabas argues against the Sabbath pushes the date for this book forward out of the 1st century. The fact that in doing this, he doesn't try to replace the Sabbath outright pushes the date back into the early years of the 2nd century. Why? Because towards the end of the 2nd century, you start to see people changing it over. So the way that this is spoken of shows you very clearly, it triangulates the time period very nicely. Although he overstates the evidence, it is interesting that a non-Sabbatarian scholar such as Westcott denies that Barnabas dates from the 1st century on the basis of the anti-Sabbatarian 15th chapter. The letter also affirms the abrogation of the Sabbath and the general celebration of the Lord's Day, which seems to show it could not have been written before the beginning of the 2nd century. B.F. Westcott, yada, yada, yada. Actually, saying abrogation of the Sabbath might be too strongly worded when dealing with the epistle of Barnabas, because abrogation would involve setting the Sabbath aside. True. Whereas Barnabas speaks only of postponing its observance until a later time. Oh, Barnabas. This wasn't written by Barnabas, by the way. Again, it's just another Gnostic letter. During the 7th period of 1,000 years, his argument is based not on the resurrection of Christ, but on the theory of 7 successive millennial world ages. Now, where does that come from? Well, if you know your history, then you know that comes from the Kabbalah. So, conclusion, the Epistle of Barnabas is a Gnostic work. It's very interesting to analyze because it shows you the evolution of, evolution as a theory for explaining how we got here is nonsense, but you can see the evolution of something, and there are transition fossils, so to speak, in these various letters. It happened after the Didache. Who knows when exactly it was written, like 120, 130, 140, something like that. But it happened after, and it shows you Satan's slow and persistent scheming and culture shaping with Gnosticism and various deceptions, little by little, step by step by step by step. Remember that at this time there was a lot of dark persecution that was being tag-teamed with Gnosticism, philosophy, pagan converts, etc., etc. You had dark and light simultaneously attacking the church to shape and basically reintegrate and create the counterfeit that you have today. Eventually, the Gnostic reality became the institution, and that's what you have today with its Gnostic Sabbath of Sunday keeping. Sunday as the Sabbath is a Gnostic Sabbath. It is not based on the truth. It's based on knowledge, on tradition, on typology that doesn't exist, on philosophy. These are knowledge. It's not based on the truth. The fourth commandment has never been done away with. It's never been reinterpreted. God never gave authority to anybody to reinterpret his laws. And it never was reinterpreted. The fourth commandment is the fourth commandment, and that's on the seventh day of the week, which is, for us, we call Saturday. If you believe that Sunday is the Sabbath, your only argument is tradition, which is knowledge, which is gnosis, which is based on nothing. It's based on smoke and mirrors and invented conjectures of men. Now, Barnabas is interesting because on one hand, you see in the writing style a very cautious writing style when it comes to the Sabbath. The writer is very cautious. He's not saying the Sabbath has been done away with, the Lord's Day is Sunday. He's not saying these types of things. He's just being very cautious. He's upholding the Sabbath on one hand and saying, oh, well, the Sabbath is just this thing we have to keep, but we can't keep it right now because we're so sinful. We're going to keep it in the golden age that's coming in the millennial reign. And so it's very, very interesting because you have caution with the Sabbath, meaning that fits very much in line with the narrative that we've been constructing with a church that was largely Jewish, largely Sabbath-keeping around that time. And the author is not trying to piss anybody off. Do you get it? This shows you, proof upon proof, with everything else we've looked at, that the date that this was written out confirms the culture of the time. Because the author is not saying the Sabbath is done away with. He's upholding the Sabbath as a command. The problem he presents to you is nobody can keep it because everybody's sinful, and we're going to keep it perfectly when Jesus returns. Very Gnostic. And the 1,000-year thing is super Gnostic, which shows you how old these ideas are. So if you believe these ideas, please watch my Masoretic series, Psyop, and get edified, because these are from the Kabbalah. Nevertheless, very, very interesting that Barnabas mentions this 6,000, 1,000-year situation. So Barnabas is not attacking the Sabbath in the sense that he's doing away with it. He's attacking it very subversively, in the sense of saying, look, it's this great thing, but we can't really keep it. So, get together on Sunday instead. That's kind of the Christian Sabbath until Jesus returns. Very, very clever. Very, very clever. The author didn't want to piss anybody off and make any ridiculous claims that the Sabbath has been completely done away with and replaced by Sunday. He's not saying that at all. On the other hand, you see lots of Gnostic subversion that comes baked into this upholding of the fourth commandment. So on one hand, he upholds the fourth commandment, but in that he sneaks in a lot of Gnostic subversion. This is, you can tell this is like influenced by the devil one way or another. I don't know who wrote the Epistle of Barnabas, but it's a Gnostic work, and Gnosticism is of the devil. It's the tree of knowledge. You see things like romanticizing the eighth day, the first day of the week, the eighth day, allegorizing the Sabbath into this eternal Sabbath rest, the 7,000 years, that's going to be the Sabbath rest for mankind, justifying lawlessness, essentially justifying laws, saying nobody can keep the Sabbath, so you might as well not keep it because they're too sinful. You're basically justifying lawlessness with humility, saying, oh, look, we're being so humble, we're just recognizing our sinfulness, so nobody can keep the Sabbath right now, which is so antichrist. You're justifying lawlessness with a veil of humility and trying to honor God. We're just too unworthy to keep the Sabbath. When we can't do it right now, we have to wait for the millennial reign. In the meantime, the 8th day is when Jesus resurrected, so we can gladly celebrate that because, that's a day that's just a day that we're doing. And of course, the 6,000 to 1,000 year timeline, which of course is based on Kabbalah. A lot of Christians believe this nonsense. It's wrong. And I can prove it to you. Just go watch my Masoretic series, Psyop. You can learn, first and foremost, why this exists. And it's very interesting to me, actually, because that's a little tangent, but whatever. The Jews in the Talmud claim that Shem is Melchizedek. Okay? Why do they do that? Because when the apostles went out and the various letters to the various churches went out, and the letter to the Hebrews especially that was proving that Jesus is the Messiah with all these Old Testament verses, when those things went out into the world, the unbelieving Jews went to work very quickly to try to discredit these letters. So what do? They changed the Old Testament. They went and changed the verses. They created their own new version of the Old Testament, which we now have as the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is inferior. Not that you can't get the truth from it, but certain things have been changed. Now, God, despite these things, has preserved his truth, which is very, very important. But you have to realize that the Masoretic text was corrupted by the Jews. Just like how Westcott and Hort have many dubious associations to the New Testament. The KJV onlyists point out that Westcott and Hort were occultists and, wanted to attack the Bible. Yes, the devil has been raging against God's word from the very beginning. And yet, God has preserved his message. If you pick up an NLT, which I would never recommend to anybody, still, if you know how to read the Bible and use good hermeneutics, I can pick up an NLT and defend every major Christian doctrine without any problems, because I know how to read in context, even though I would never recommend you to read an NLT. I think a literal translation like KJV, ESV, NASB, those types of things are good. Young's literal translation, those types of literal translations are good because they're more accurate. Doesn't mean they're fully accurate, but nevertheless, the point is that every translation has problems. Most people are unaware that the Masoretic text has many problems. One of the big problems is the timeline of Genesis 11. Because alongside all of the messianic prophecies that they changed to disassociate Jesus from the New Testament and discredit the authors who are writing, joke's on them because the Septuagint shows you that these things were true because 9 out of the 10 citations of the New Testament follow the Septuagint. 90%, more than 90%, most of them do, which shows you that the scriptures were changed. Isn't that interesting? So there's that. But the Septuagint also preserves the correct ages of the patriarchs. Now, part of the Jewish attack on this was to discredit Christ as the priest of Melchizedek, which is what the book of Hebrews claims. So in order to do that, they said, oh, well, look, the ages of the patriarchs are actually different. They shortened the ages of the patriarchs. They basically removed almost 1,000 years of history from Genesis 11. If you compare the ages between Genesis 11 in the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, there's about 1,000 years, 950 years, something like that, of missing history. There's an extra Canaan in there. The ages are much longer for everybody. There's a lot of time because those are the true ages. And we know that with very simple facts. You can watch my series on it. But the point is that there's about 1,000 years missing history. Now, why would they do that? Well, very simple. Because for them, they can now say that Shem lived and intersected with Abraham. And unfortunately, Christians believe this crap today. They believe this nonsense. Like Answers in Genesis teaches this. They have these little fancy charts of, oh, look, Shem lived to be with Abraham. And it's like, no, he did not. Shem died long before Abraham because there's 1,000 years of missing history. So why is this important? Because the Talmud tells you that Shem received his priesthood from Noah because Noah had the covenant and whatever else, right? So Shem passed that priesthood directly to Abraham, and then Abraham passed it through his sons, and there you go. Jesus can't be a priest by order of Melchizedek because he never received the priesthood from Levi. That's the rabbinical argument against Jesus. And whenever you believe the 6,000 to 1,000 year timeline nonsense, you are aligning with Kabbalah, because the Kabbalah also has this 6,000 years of history and 1,000 year golden age in the future. Now, The Jews, in doing this antichrist move, against Christ, there's the dark aspect of attacking Jesus and delegitimizing him. And of course, there has to be a solution. There has to be another false Christ that they're presenting, right? There's against and in place of. The against is the violence done to the text. Now you have a different timeline. You have 6,000 years, and that fits nicely into the Kabbalah 1,000-year golden age, which is everything's going to be great in the future, and we're going to achieve this golden age. Do you see the pattern? And as a result, because the timeline of the earth is shorter, you now can say, oh, well, we're before the year 6,000, and the Messiah has yet to come. He's going to come and bring a 1,000-year golden age, and, that'll be the Sabbath rest that we're all waiting for. This is Kabbalah, and it's Masoretic, Hebrew, rabbinic nonsense. Jewish fables. And I proved that quite a bit in my Masoretic PSYOP series. Doesn't mean you shouldn't read your KJV. I think your KJV is a great book. Just realize that it's a translation. And like all translation, it has problems. So when you see the Epistle of Barnabas, which is, again, something around 120, 130, 140, something like that, very interesting. Also, that it mentions this Kabbalistic 6,000, 1,000 situation, because that shows you and confirms that the Jews were already putting this out into the world, and this idea, which is very ancient, very Gnostic, very, antichrist, about the future golden age, and we can bring it, we can bring the Messiah, we can bring the golden age, and, we can have this 1,000-year golden age. This is nonsense. And of course, all these things influenced the early Christian writers and their premillennial ideas, which eventually became dispensationalism with the Jesuits, and yada, yada, yada. So Barnabas is a perfect transition fossil, quote unquote, to see how these attitudes were slowly but subversively being injected into the culture. Slowly but subversively. Don't want to be too controversial, but want to put a little bit of poison, a little bit of 6,000-year timeline, a little bit alternate history, a little bit allegorizing of the first day. Let's, the Sabbath is so great, but we can't really keep it, so we can keep this first day thing because that's in honor of the resurrection, and it's just all around your head. And this happened, but again, you notice that you're not calling Sunday the Lord's Day explicitly. That would be way too controversial for the time of Barnabas was written. So it shows you, little by little, step by step, it proves to you that people kept the Sabbath, and yet they were being attacked with culture shaping on all sides for centuries. Now, the next section of this is titled Ignatius and the Letter to the Magnesians. Magnesians chapter 4 is normally not one we think about in connection with the history of Sunday sacredness, but it has much to teach us. Quote, "It is fitting then not only to be called Christians, but also to be so in reality, as some indeed give one to the title of bishop, but do all things without him. Now such persons seem to me not to be possessed of a good conscience, seeing that they are not steadfastly gathered together according to the commandment." Perhaps this is a commandment to obey bishops recorded in some early document, but if the commandment refers to one of the 10 commandments, only one of these has to do with worship and by implication with gathering for worship. Context will have to be a determining factor here. Chapters 8 through 9 are those that most commonly figure in discussions of the history of the Sabbath, and especially chapter 9. Now remember, Ignatius is not written until like 250 AD, at least. We'll get to that later. But anyway, just remember that. Chapter 8, caution against false doctrines. Be not deceived with strange doctrines, nor with old fables, which are unprofitable. For if we still live according to Jewish law, we acknowledge that we have not received grace. For the divinest prophets lived according to Jesus Christ. On this account also they were persecuted, being inspired by his grace to fully convince the unbelieving that there is one God, who has manifested himself by Jesus Christ his Son, who is his eternal word, not proceeding forth from silence, and who in all things pleased him that sent him. Chapter 9. Let us live with Christ. If therefore those who were brought up in the ancient order of things have come to the possession of a new hope, no longer observing the Sabbath, meketi sabbatizontes, but living in the observance of the Lord's day, alakata zontes, on which also our life has sprung up again by him and by his death, whom some deny, by which mystery we have obtained faith and therefore endure, that we may be found the disciples of Jesus our only Master. How shall we be able to live apart from him, whose disciples the prophets themselves in the Spirit did wait for him as their teacher, and therefore he, whom they rightly waited for, having come raised from the dead. It's clear that Ignatius is saying something about the Sabbath in chapter 9, and that it is not positive in nature, but what exactly is it? It will help to tighten up the translation. The words no longer observing the Sabbath are literally no longer sabbatizing. Those translated but living in observance of the Lord's day are literally but living zontes according to the Lord's ... Another noun is expected at the end of the clause. Which one does the author intend? Inserting day would make sense in view of the earlier reference to the misuse of the Sabbath. Inserting life would also make sense because of the later reference to our own Christian lives, which follows in the next clause, i.e., quote, on which also our life has sprung up again by him and by his death. The words on which could also be in which. The word which is feminine singular in Greek, which would fit with either day, hemeron, feminine accusative singular, or life, zoen, feminine accusative singular. Both interpretations offer reasonable accommodations to context so far. Is there a way to choose between them? At this point, the evidence becomes murky. Richard Lewis refers to the phrase, those who are brought up in the ancient order of things, back to the divinest prophets in chapter 8, but this is not the only available interpretation. Saying the ancient Jewish prophets stopped keeping the Sabbath and kept Sunday instead would be wildly anachronistic, as Lewis points out. There seems to be a contrast between them, those who were brought up, and us, on which also our life has sprung up. But Ignatius were talking about Jewish Christians instead, who no longer live in the Jewish manner, but according to the Lord's something, possibly life. That would make sense in context. All the more so since the next clause says, on which also our life has sprung up again by him and his death. So the translation of day is not necessarily the right translation. It's not a horrible mistranslation. It's a possible translation. But is it correct is the question. Could be according to the Lord's life. So there's a comparison of being legalistic and living in this new life, not living according to the Lord's day and basically not sabbatizing. That's how the Catholic translation would be presented to you in the Catholic interpretation. But again, even so, Ignatius wasn't written until like 250 AD. Moving on. Magnesius 9 does not give us an early witness to the term Lord's Day, as many suppose. Despite popular translations that imply otherwise, the term simply does not appear in the letter to the Magnesians. What we have is not Kuriake Hemera, Lord's Day, but Kata Kuriaken Zontes, living according to the Lord's life, on which our own life has sprung up. What's there that makes people think of the Lord's Day as Lord's? What's missing from Lord's Day is a crucial omission. Yeah, the fact that there's no day in this again very strongly suggests that there's a different translation here. Living according to the Lord's life, not the Lord's day. So, conclusion, remember that the Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church apologists will always default to Ignatius of Antioch. That's their default, because they say that he was written so early on, but this is just not true. Half of his letters are forgeries, and we will look at that right now. This is from bible.ca/history of Ignatius forgeries. You can find, these are relatively easy facts to find. This is not some erudite type of thing, but the real Ignatius lived about 110 AD. A total of 15 letters were allegedly written by Ignatius. We take the view that all 15 of Ignatius' letters are forgeries. The fact that neither Eusebius nor Jerome, that's in 300 AD and 495 AD respectively, make reference to the first 8 Ignatian letters, which are Tarsians, Antiochians, Hero, Philippians, Maria to Ignatius, Mary, 1 John, 2 John, Virgin Mary. So the fact that they don't make any reference to these letters makes it likely that they were composed as late as 300 to 500 AD. It is this reason that all scholars reject these 8 letters as forgeries. Some scholars, however, accept that the 7 Ignatian letters are genuine. These 7 Ignatian letters are Polycarp, Ephesians, Magnesians, Philadelphians, Romans, Smyrnaeans, and Trallians. We feel these scholars are in error and that even the 7 Ignatian letters are forgeries. Point number 2, we have taken the view that all of Ignatius' writings are forgeries and unreliable. There are 15 books attributed to Ignatius, 8 are surely forgeries and spurious, 7 are considered by some as genuine, although many scholars also believe they are all forgeries. Again, we view all Ignatius' writings as forgeries. They purport to be written by Ignatius, who lived in 110 AD. We believe it is clear, however, that they are all no earlier than 220 AD and more likely 250 AD. Although they are forgeries, they do represent the views of the author in the time of 250 AD. We see a clear change from the Bible pattern from a plurality of elders, talked about this before, also called bishops or episcopos, deacons and saints, to a single bishop who ruled the congregations, and under him were a plurality of elders. This is huge contextual clue that this was not written in 110 AD. Huge contextual clue, because the church was way too young to have this kind of separation and hierarchy, which came later. At this point in history, congregations were still autonomous and independent. But we also see the seeds of development for the papal system, where one man rules over all churches worldwide, which first occurred in the 7th century, 6th century, 7th century. Within one of the 7 genuine Ignatian letters is a powerful clue. It is clearly a forgery from a letter from a later time. The very first historical reference to the Catholic Church is nestled warmly between very strong commands to obey the bishop as you would Jesus Christ, and the only valid baptism or communion service is the one by the bishop's authority. We feel that it is no coincidence that the first historical evidence to the Church as the Catholic Church is contained within one of the quote-unquote 7 genuine Ignatian letters. Schaff comments the following, quote, "Been found in this letter to the Romans, especially as is in this letter, we first find the use of the phrase Catholic Church in patristic writings." Yada yada tells you where it's found. We feel it is proof enough to reject it all as forgeries. "See that ye all follow the bishop, even as Jesus Christ does the Father. Let no man do anything connected with the church without the bishop. Let that be deemed a proper Eucharist, which is administered either by the bishop or by one whom he has entrusted it. Wherever the bishop shall appear, let the multitude of the people also be, even as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. It is not lawful without the bishop either to be baptized or to celebrate a love feast, but whatsoever be he shall approve of, that is also pleasing to God, so that everything that is done may be secure and valid." Now, does that sound to you like the early seeds of papal supremacy? Yeah, absolutely. It's completely contradictory to what the Bible prescribes as a plurality of leadership, a very decentralized situation. Now you're starting to see allegiance to one man. Of course, that took a lot of time, but it happened relatively quickly in the grand scheme of things because the devil was very busy. So this tells you this was not written. The other 7 were not written in, this is from the Epistle of Smyrnaeans, what I just read, chapter 8. "Let nothing be done without the bishop." This tells you that these other ones that supposedly are not forgeries, they are forgeries in the sense that they weren't written by the actual Ignatius. They were written in 250 AD, approximately around that time. Having said this, the Ignatian letters do represent real history for the dates that they were actually written in. Forgeries, yes, but even the forgeries prove that there was no one bishop over the Church universal. So they were very hierarchical, and yes, you start to see these types of things where people were being told to have allegiance to one man, that type of situation. But what you don't see, which again, even if you acknowledge that these are forgeries, they still testify against the Catholic Church. Either way, they testify against the RCC. But even if you acknowledge them, they still testify against the Catholic Church because there's no one bishop over all bishops. That's an important point. The first 8 letters of Ignatius do provide insights into what the 4th or 5th century author wished Ignatius had said in support of the author's current setting. The 7 letters of Ignatius being written probably around 250 AD likewise give an insight into what was going on in 250 AD. We therefore date the 8 letters of Ignatius at around 300 to 500 AD and the 7 letters of Ignatius at about 250 AD. Quote, "It is now the universal opinion of critics that the first 8 of these professed Ignatian letters are spurious," in other words, forgeries. "They bear in themselves indubitable proofs of being the production of a later age than that in which Ignatius lived. Neither Eusebius nor Jerome make the least reference to them, and they are now by common consent set aside as forgeries, which were at various dates and to preserve special purposes put forth under the name of the celebrated Bishop of Antioch." Yeah, they were put forward under his name again to give it credence and to give it authority, but this person never wrote such things. The whole story of Ignatius is more legendary than real, and his writings are subject to grave suspicion of fraudulent interpolation. We have 3 different versions of the Ignatius epistles, but only one of them can be genuine, either the smaller Greek version or the later discovered Syriac versions. In the latter, which contain only 3 epistles, most of the passages on the episcopate are wanting. Indeed, yet the leading features of the institution appear even here. This is from History of the Christian Church by Philip Schaff. This next quote is from Henry Sheldon, History of the Christian Church, Volume 1. Already in the infancy of the episcopate began the second stage of development, that of express emphasis upon its importance. Ignatius of Antioch was the first to represent this stage. Again and again, in his epistles, he urges obedience to the bishop, warns against doing anything without the bishop, represents the bishop as standing to the congregation as the vice-regent of Christ. At the same time, he regarded each bishop as limited to his own congregation and recognized no essential distinctions within the episcopal body. So yes, you start to see these papal things, but you don't see full papism where there's one bishop over all the bishops. Ignatius, however, appears to have been an exception to his age in the degree of emphasis which he put upon the episcopal dignity. Yeah, because he wasn't written from his age. He stands so nearly alone in this respect that some have disposed to the question the genuineness of the epistles attributed to him. Bauer declares that it is impossible that any writer of so early an age could have uttered such high episcopal notions as to appear in the so-called Ignatian epistles. If there's no chance, but if it were such the case that Ignatius was actually written by Ignatius, he would have come across as a total buffoon, as like a madman. Nobody would have listened to him, because his claims in the time of 110 AD would have been so controversial and so out of touch that nobody would have listened to you. So it's not written by Ignatius, folks. So anyway, there's a little more here, actually. The value of the 15 forged letters. The Ignatius forgeries clearly mark that period of history when a single bishop ruled over a local church and was to view his authority as that of Jesus Christ. Members were to be told to be subject to the bishop as to Jesus Christ, also be subject to the presbytery as to the apostle of Jesus Christ. And bishop presides in the place of God, and your presbyters in the place of the assembly of apostles. Doesn't Jesus say that many false Christs will come? And if they say, look, he's there, then don't believe them. In this way, a single bishop is notably above the elders, just as Christ is above his apostles. This is actually quite blasphemous, and nothing like this is found within the New Testament. Only a man of depraved mind with an evil thirst for power would ever equate the authority of a bishop with Jesus Christ. Absolutely. And this is the problem that we have today. We also have bishops who are very young, not to treat your bishop too familiarly on account of his youth. This clearly violates the qualifications set forth in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, where bishops are called elders, meaning an elder man. The power of the bishop is also absolute. These kinds of statements actually paved the way for papal infallibility. It also took the commands to baptize and sever the communion out of the hands of the common Christian, and gave it as the sole authority of the bishop. This again is foreign to the New Testament, where there was no clergy-laity distinction. Yeah, there's priesthood of the believer. It is not lawful without the bishop either to baptize or to offer or to present sacrifice to the celebrity of a love feast. And he who does anything without the knowledge of the bishop does in reality serve the devil. This is like J. Dyer right here. J. Dyer and all of the Catholic apologists and ortho bros, this is what they're frothing their mouth for. You have no authority, blah, 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 blah. What are you basing your claim on? Are you basing it on the Bible? You have no authority when you claim such a thing. Because what you're claiming is actually antichrist and anti-Bible. You're basing it off of smoke and mirrors and forgeries. So you don't have authority. It is clear from the forged Ignatius writings, however, that patriarchs or even dioceses, a mother church ruling over a number of other local churches in a geographic area, did not exist at that time. Yeah, you have to remember that the dioceses were based on the Roman provinces. Okay, once you had the 4th century and you had the councils and all the things that were happening around the time, the diocese model is based off the provincial model of the Roman Empire. That's how these things came about. So what did you have in the 1st century? You didn't have that. You had a bunch of Jews that were being persecuted and meeting in underground churches and totally decentralized. You didn't have hierarchies. Why would you need a hierarchy when everything is so decentralized and dispersed? So obviously these are forgeries. At this point of history, Ignatius provides valuable insight to the stage between local bishops ruling over a single congregation at the age of the patriarchs and the age of the patriarchs that existed in 325 AD. Yeah, this is a transition fossil, just like Barnabas, just like all these other things. You see the transitions. You see the transitions going through time, how Satan slowly patiently and relentlessly wove his counterfeit into being, which is Phenomenal. It's truly phenomenal. One more point. Philip Schaff acknowledges that there has been a broad and long-standing view that all of the Ignatian letters are forgeries and leaves the matter for the reader to decide for himself. Schaff does clearly reject all the letters as forgeries, as can be seen in his comments. Quote, "The whole story of Ignatius is more legendary than real, and his writings are subject to grave suspicion of fraudulent interpolation." That's History of the Christian Church, Volume 2, Chapter 4. "But I am content to leave the whole matter without comment to the minds of Christians of whatever school and to their independent conclusions. The reader may judge by comparison for himself which of these is to be accepted as genuine." And he has a whole thing on here, Philip Schaff. I'm not going to read it. You can check it out for yourself. It's a great website to document this whole thing with Ignatius. But the point is that Ignatius of Antioch has many giveaways contextually that prove he wasn't written in the 1st century or even the early 2nd century. Probably a mix of the 4th century, mid 3rd century to 4th century, and even as late as the 6th century or even beyond. How do we know that? Well, we know from the textual clues, very clearly so, and from history. All of the history that I've been outlining for you today. You'd have no consistency between his writings and what the early church was actually dealing with. So that means that it wasn't written from that time, but it was being used as a way to sort of support the church's positions and backdate these traditions back before they actually existed. Now, is there a history of doing such a thing? Absolutely. Rome is famous for her forgeries, like Liber Pontificalis, the book of the pontifexes that supposedly documents every pope back to, Peter and the succession of popes. Only problem is that was written in like the 500s, 500 years after Peter. So was it really going back to the apostles, or was it just something people made up in order to justify something that would be completely against the Bible and justify it as the will of God? No, this is the will of God. Trust me, it's the will of God. Trust me, trust me, trust me. Liber Pontificalis, one of the early works. And of course, you have other things too, like the donation of Constantine, which was a forgery that the popes used. It was literally a forgery. The popes used this for hundreds of years. I documented in my papal series. They used it for hundreds of years to justify papal supremacy and their power and, basically their authority as if from God. And yet it was a forgery. And even when a Catholic exposed it as a forgery, he was condemned. His books were put on a blacklist. And it wasn't until, I think, something like, it was written probably sometime around 800 or 900 AD, I think. And it took something like 700 years, 800 years for it to finally be admitted as a forgery. So you're talking for centuries it was used and appealing. Look, the donation of Constantine. Constantine gave us our power and authority. All of these claims of papal supremacy and the continuation of power were based on smoke and mirrors. So Rome is famous for these types of things. Is it any mystery that there might be other forged documents that were used to basically make it seem as if this is an apostolic thing passed down through the apostles and this is what the apostles wanted? Yeah, there's a lot of motive, because when your system is antichrist, you have to justify its existence as the will of God. And of course, modern day, you have things like the Shroud of Turin and all the things with that, right in time for the Jubilee. So anyway, there are countless false signs and wonders, and the coming of the lawless one is by all the power and workings of Satan, whether it's Eucharistic miracles, appearances of Mary in the sky, forged documents, everything that Satan possibly has to bring this reality into the world has been happening over the last 2,000 plus years. So whether you believe Ignatius' letter to the Magnesians was written in 250 AD or whether it was written later, doesn't matter, because it's either way, it's a forgery. It's not even relevant to the conversation of the Sabbath, because by the 3rd century, if it was written in 250 AD, by the 3rd century, many things were already changing. You saw, like with Clement, Origen, Tertullian, things were already starting to change. Sabbath perception was shifting. The celebration of the Easter was happening on Sunday now more than it was for Quartodecimanism. The stage was getting set for the 300s with Constantine and the first Sunday law. So things were very different by that point in time. Even so, just like with Barnabas, it shows you a dualistic picture. The original language of Ignatius' writings does not include the word day, just like Didache doesn't include the word day. So what is actually being said is debatable. And Catholic apologists and orthobro apologists will do two things that are wrong to try to present this and justify their institution. They'll present it as being written in 110 AD, which is not true. And they'll present the writing as, look, it says the Lord's Day, when in fact it doesn't actually include the word day. So what is actually being said there is debatable. It could be the Lord's life, could be something else. It could be a whole different statement that is very plausible. There seems to be some negative PR against the Sabbath being presented to you by Ignatius's writing to the Magnesians. But the solution being presented is debatable. Is the solution the Lord's day, or is it the Lord's life, which would be more in line with the negative Jewish attitudes that were rising around that time? Like, don't be like the Jews, don't be a legalist. There was a lot of anti-Jew sentiments going on. We're Christians now. Is this what's being said? It's not very clear, folks. It's not very clear. Anybody who demands that this says the Lord's Day in Ignatius's writings, first off, even if it does, it doesn't matter. Do you get it? That's the point, Wallace. It doesn't matter because the writings are forgeries. They're made at the earliest in the 3rd century. So it doesn't matter because by then, things were already changing quite a bit. But either way, the point is you can see the same thing. Now it's more aggressive. 100 years after the Epistle of Barnabas, you start to see even more aggression towards the Sabbath, more pushing, more culture shaping, more and more, and eventually, the final trick with Constantine. Now, I believe there's a final section to this, Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho. Justin Martyr wrote widely and died in AD 165. His dialogue with Trypho is explicit and urgent in its argument against keeping the Sabbath, but he, like Barnabas, calls Sabbath, Sabbath, and Sunday the 8th day. Quote, the command of circumcision, again, bidding them always circumcise the children on the 8th day, was a type of the true circumcision by which we are circumcised from deceit and iniquity through him who rose from the dead on the first day after the Sabbath, namely through our Lord Jesus Christ. For the first day after the Sabbath, remaining the first day of all days, is called, however, the 8th, according to the number of all the days of the cycle, and yet remains the first. Here, 2 different days are clearly referred to, but Sunday is the 8th day, not the Lord's day. Like Ignatius before him, he does not use the term the Lord's day. In the passages quoted, it would appear that the Sabbath was still revered to a degree in Justin's time, but was now on the same level as Sunday, with Sunday perhaps taking precedence over the Sabbath. One could never fast on Sunday, the 8th day, almost never on the Sabbath. Notice that Justin's argument for Sunday observance is based again not on the resurrection of Christ, but on an allegory involving circumcision. Sunday worship represents the true circumcision performed not on the Lord's Day, but on the 8th day. So these things are Gnostic again. Justin Martyr was one of the earlier voices that lived around after the Didache, who was allegorizing the 8th day, was very much using typology, very much anti-Jew, we need to separate from the Jews, that kind of thing. Very much an outsider, because most of the church, even during his time, was still keeping the Sabbath, very Jewish-oriented. So he was by no means a representative of the majority. So when people present to you Justin Martyr's writings, which again, they don't talk about the Lord's Day, but just in general, when they present to you that writing, you have to realize that Justin Martyr was just like a lone wolf. He's like more than Nick Fuentes is today, for example. Nick Fuentes does not represent the majority of culture yet, at least at the time of this video. Maybe in the future he will, and who knows how that's going to go. We know what the Bible has to say. But the point is that I would say even more extreme than Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes has very extreme views, okay? He's not the majority of culture. Same with Justin Martyr. He has documents that he's written, but he's by no means a representative of what people actually believed in the majority. Very, very important. So I've talked about Justin Martyr a lot on this topic. He's one of the earlier voices that are presented by pro-Sunday people like Orthodox and Catholics. His writings are not forgeries, unlike Ignatius. So he is very early, and we can prove that. He lived in the 60 or so years after the Didache was written. So from about, 105, something like that, to like 165. He was not advocating for a Sunday Sabbath. Very important. He's not advocating for resting on Sunday. He was adamant against the Jews. He had a lot of things against the Jews, and he romanticized the first day of the week, the 8th day. That was very much in line with the other things that were happening around that time, with the Gnostic conversions, because Justin Martyr was a convert, just like Clement, just like Origen, just like all of these people. Yet, despite all of these attitudes of being pro the eighth day and romanticizing the eighth day and being very anti-Jew. Despite these attitudes, despite that, he makes a very clear distinction between the Sabbath as a named day. He doesn't call it the seventh day, he just calls it the Sabbath, and the first day of the week. He distinguishes these two. Very, very important. He also never refers to Sunday as the new Sabbath, or he calls Sunday the Lord's Day. Never. So he makes the distinction between Sabbath and the first day of the week, and as far as the first day of the week, he just leaves it at that. He doesn't give it a special name, doesn't call it the Lord's Day. Now, if we are to believe the Roman Catholic narrative, the institutional narrative, that the following happened. Immediately after the resurrection, everyone started keeping Sunday as the main day of rest and gathering. That John acknowledges this practice in Revelation 1. That the Didache in the first century also acknowledges this practice when it says the Lord's Day. That Ignatius of Antioch in the first century, again, he wasn't written in the first century, but this is the narrative. Ignatius of Antioch, first century, writes about this practice, right? So you have basically three main witnesses, according to the Catholic narrative. Actually, four if you count the book of Acts misinterpretation, and five if you count Corinthians. Again, none of those are actually true witnesses. But the Catholic narrative is that when Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 16, on the first day gather these things, oh, that means they're gathering for the Sunday worship. Okay, great. And they're doing the Eucharist, and there's a priest there as an altar and everything else, right? The Catholic Mass. And Acts 20, they're gathering on Sunday. Okay, and John is talking about the Lord's Day. That means this practice is already there. And the Didache is there. Then Ignatius of Antioch, too, he talks about Sunday. Okay, all these witnesses talk about something that was largely universal by the time Justin Martyr was born. Okay, that's the Catholic narrative, which of course by now you realize all of this is BS, but that's the Catholic narrative. So by the time Justin Martyr was born, all of these things are witnesses in the Catholic narrative that this was a prevalent practice in the Christian world, in the Christian mind. Okay, let's believe that for a little bit, even though we know it's a lie. Let's try to go with it. Then the question, the million-dollar question that you need to ask every single Catholic apologist or every Catholic that you argue with, why is Justin Martyr silent on this issue? Why is he silent? Why do none of his writings, which elevate Sunday and the first day of the week, ever call Sunday the Lord's Day? If this was already something that was happening, according to all of these witnesses, supposedly, why does Justin Martyr stay completely silent on this issue? And he never calls Sunday the Lord's Day. Never. Zero. It makes zero sense, my friends, if for 70 years before this man was born, okay, from, let's say, after the crucifixion, 31 AD, to whenever he was born, I don't know, 100 AD, 105 AD, something like that. 70 plus years before this man was born, supposedly there's this tradition that's central to the Christian identity, and that must be sanctified. This is the new Christian day, the Lord's Day. It doesn't make sense that for 70 years before this man was born, something is going on. He's born, he writes a lot about Sunday, very anti-Jewish, has no motive to be like Judaizing, very motivated to call it the Lord's Day, and yet he doesn't. He's very cautious with that, despite all of this evidence. That doesn't make sense. That's an anomaly. So we know that Justin Martyr lived. His writings aren't forgeries. That means that what's actually the anomaly or the forgeries are the things that are being twisted to present to you this twisted narrative. Ignatius of Antioch is not written in 100 AD. The Didache is not talking about Sunday. John is not talking about Sunday. The New Testament doesn't reveal to you that Sunday became the Sabbath, etc., etc., etc. That's the consistent narrative. That's the reason why Justin Martyr is silent, because that practice was not yet happening during his time. He was pushing on it, and certainly there was starting to be an interest and debate and discussion with the first day of the week, starting to get a little prominence, but it wasn't by any means the Christian Sabbath. People kept the Sabbath. There were many that were very much still Jewish and had their Jewish roots, so it's just not true. You had a predominantly Jewish church keeping the Sabbath very early on and in various places well into the Great Schism and beyond. That's 1,000 years, folks. John was not talking about Sunday, he was talking about the Sabbath. The Didache was not talking about Sunday, but the Sabbath. And even so, there could be an argument that it's not even talking about the Sabbath at all, based on the original language. Maybe there's something else that it's talking about. According to the Lord's command, to do what? To break bread? Probably. Not the Lord's day, because the word day is not there. Ignatius of Antioch, again, doesn't, it's not written in the first century, and it doesn't even say day in the original language. And many of the other sources that we covered are either twisted or they're misinterpreted, mistranslated, whatever else. So what does the Roman Catholic Church have? As a result of all of these conclusions, what does the Roman Catholic Church have? What does the Orthodox Church have on this issue? What do harlot Protestant denominations have when they're frothing at the mouth for Sunday keeping? They have nothing. They have smoke and mirrors. That's all they have. So final thoughts. I hope this was edifying for you today. When I was compiling the research for my Lord's Day series earlier the previous year in 2025, I did not have all of the pieces to the puzzle that I've presented to you today. I think today was very good to add to that series because there's a lot of little excellent pieces that complement all that work. So I hope that you were edified by that, and I hope that you can spread that truth to others as well. The church history of that early time is very, very complex. It's very nuanced. However, God has preserved that history so we can remember. We have to remember, and he has preserved enough clues and facts for us to remember. The textual clues, both in the New Testament and later non-biblical writings presented to you today, are very valuable proofs of the truth and of the true narrative that's happened. There's no evidence, zero, none, in the New Testament that Sunday was a tradition at all. Whether it was just a tradition that was given by the apostles to gather only on Sunday, or the full Monty of resting on Sunday as the new Sabbath. No such thing. No such evidence. There's no evidence of Sunday being called the Lord's Day at all in the New Testament. The evidence shows you very clearly that they kept the Sabbath. The Sabbath is mentioned dozens of times in the New Testament. The first day is only mentioned a handful of times, less than, and it has no name, and only once as a gathering, and even that is a matter-of-fact gathering. It's not a specific tradition. The apostles were also persecuted, and not a single time, my friends, were ever accused of breaking the Sabbath. And in a predominantly Jewish environment, that would have been the first accusation to levy against people that you want to kill. But they couldn't make that accusation because people knew that they were keeping the Sabbath. So it never happened because these people were keeping the Sabbath, and that means that they passed that down to their disciples and their Jewish kin. They were converting because this was part of the Jewish identity. It was central to the Jewish identity. Of course, as time moves on, countless things change the demographics and the perceptions of the church. The devil was absolutely relentless in his attack. And hopefully, by studying these things, you can see the wily schemes of the devil, how he's able to work in so many different directions simultaneously. It's truly pretty crazy. He was incredibly cunning, incredibly persistent, incredibly relentless in bringing about this change of worshiping and resting on Sunday. You can worship God on any day of the week, but Sunday rest, Sunday sacredness, this is an exclusively pagan mystery religion concept that Satan has actualized in order to receive his own worship, and he's going to bring that back into the world in attached to all of the religious things that are happening. That's why the New World Order is going to be Christian. It's not going to be Muslim. It's not going to be Jew. It's not going to be communist. So learn the truth. But in the first couple centuries, you had many elements: persecutions, Gnosticism, Sabbath fasting, mass conversions, replacing the authority of the church fathers, compromises on doctrine, etc., etc. There's so much stuff going on in those first 100 years that anyone trying to present to you some continuous lineage, apostolic succession, or tradition of bishops and Eucharist, or all the things that people do today in these religions, is completely lying and delusional. Either they don't know church history and they've been deceived themselves, or they know church history and they are willfully misrepresenting the truth. That's the only two possibilities. It really is. The Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox apologists will always, when you do this argument back and forth with them, they will always oversimplify the narrative. They will always take things out of context. They are always going to backdate their religion to the apostles. Otherwise, if they don't do those things, the house of cards collapses and the institution that they are part of is revealed to be a counterfeit. So the very existence of Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy relies on having to constantly misrepresent the truth about the early church and about the early church history. But they don't have anything to stand on other than invented traditions, forged documents, false history, twisted interpretations, twisted translations, and of course, tradition. Traditions of men, because that's what it is. It's the tree of knowledge. It's gnosis, knowledge. It's the word of the devil made out of thin air, not the word of God that has been based on reality. When God tells you to rest on the seventh day, it's anchored in a pattern of creation and redemption. Because the seventh day has been the seventh day since the very beginning. God has preserved the sequence of time, which is profound. Even though we have a name for it, doesn't matter what the name is. We call it the Sabbath. It's the seventh day. And that seventh day commemorates the weekly anniversary of the creation of the world and also the redemption of the world. Those are based in reality. So when you honor the seventh day, you are aligning with life, the tree of life, what actually exists. God is the God of the living. You're honoring the truth, something that actually happened. When you're honoring to rest on Sunday, you're honoring the word of the devil, because nobody ever rested on Sunday. God did not rest on Sunday. God worked on the first day of the week in creating the world. Let there be light. God resurrected on the first day of the week and was doing stuff. He was running around, talking to people. He was working. He was beginning that new work of the new creation, right? So God was working on the first day of the week. When you rest on the first day of the week, you are doing it according to what? You're doing it according to the word of the man of sin, which is just an invented word based on invented authority, which is smoke and mirrors. So you are obeying a lie. You are going with the tree of knowledge, not the tree of life. So once you see it, hopefully you can help others see it as well. Once you see it, you can't go back. And that's my goal with these things, is to give you such detail and research that you can see the truth. You can see the truth and come out of Babylon, because we have to be on the winning side of history, even though the winning side of history right now looks like the crazy side. So share this message with others, and hopefully it will help you engage in discussions in your own circle that are productive, in your own groups, in your own home churches, whatever you happen to be doing. More people need to learn these precious truths, folks, and they need to learn before it's too late. So edify yourself on these truths, on these simple talking points. I know we talked a lot about history. I know we talked a lot about these, various church fathers' statements and quotes and things. You don't need to be memorizing all these things, but you do need to know the principles. Okay, the early church was Jewish. The apostles were Jews. Okay, that doesn't mean we have to keep the feast or anything, but you have to understand, what is the context of that? What does that mean? They were Jews. The last thing on earth they would do is change the day that they were keeping the Sabbath on, which is the center of their identity to God. So when John was writing and the Didache was writing, what they meant is the Sabbath. And again, there are translation issues that we need to debate and discuss, and some of these things aren't even talking about the Lord's Day. So it's a very, very finely nuanced thing, and it's a gradual change, gradual. Got to remember the key word, gradual. Anybody who tries to say that it's a unified picture, they're not being accurate. So get edified, be a Berean, get some resources if you need to, get the USB, get the books, get some resources to help you start your own group at home if you need to, start your own home church. That's what my recommendation is to you, is to start your own Bible study group and have friends that you discuss with. Be active with all of these things and use this information for the good. Because this is going to become more and more important as time goes on. And one day you will have to make a choice whether you believe me today or not. Until then, I hope you do make the right choice. We'll see you next time. Take care, and God bless.
If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable, and shalt honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord. And I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father. For the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it.